Section 1 of The Goodness of Saint Rocque and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Goodness of Saint Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. The Goodness of Saint Rocque. Manuela was tall and slender and graceful, and once you knew her, the lithe form could never be mistaken. She walked with the easy spring that comes from a perfectly arched foot. Today she swept swiftly down Marais Street, casting a quick glance here and there from under her heavy veil, as if she feared she was being followed. If you had peered under the veil, you would have seen that Manuela's dark eyes were swollen and discolored about the lids, as though they had known a sleepless, tearful night. There had been a picnic the day before, and as merry a crowd of giddy, chattering Creole girls and boys as ever you could see boarded the ramshackle dummy train that puffed its way wheezily out wide Elysian Fields Street, around the lily-covered bayous to Milnburg-on-the-Lake. Now a picnic at Milnburg is a thing to be remembered for ever. One charters a rickety-looking, weather-beaten dancing pavilion built over the water, and after storing the children, for your true Creole never leaves the small folks at home, and the baskets and mothers downstairs, the young folks go upstairs and dance to the tune of the best band you ever heard, for what can equal the music of a violin, a guitar, a cornet, and a bass viol to trip the quadrille to at a picnic? Then one can fish in the lake and go bathing under the prim bathhouses so severely separated sexually, and go rowing on the lake in a trim boat, followed by the shrill warnings of anxious maman. And in the evening one comes home, hat crowned with cool grey Spanish moss, hands burdened with fantastic latanier, baskets woven by the brown bayou boys, hand in hand with your dearest one, tired but happy. At this particular picnic, however, there had been bitterness of spirit. Theophile was Manuela's own especial property, and Theophile had proven false. He had not danced a single waltz or quadrille with Manuela, but had deserted her for Claralie, blonde and petite. It was Claralie whom Theophile had rowed out on the lake. It was Claralie whom Theophile had gallantly led to dinner. It was Claralie's hat that he wreathed with Spanish moss, and Claralie whom he escorted home after the jolly singing ride in town on the little dummy train. Not that Manuela lacked partners or admirers. Dear no, she was too graceful and beautiful for that. There had been more than enough for her, but Manuela loved Theophile, you see, and no one could take his place. Still, she had tossed her head and let her silvery laughter ring out in the dance, as though she were the happiest of mortals, and had tripped home with Henri, leaning on his arm, and looking up into his eyes as though she adored him. This morning she showed the traces of a sleepless night and an aching heart as she walked down Marais Street. Across wide Saint Rocque Avenue she hastened. 2 blocks to the river and 1 below, she repeated to herself breathlessly. Then she stood on the corner, gazing about her, until with a final summoning of a desperate courage she dived through a small wicket gate into a garden of weed-choked flowers. There was a hoarse, rusty little bell on the gate that gave querulous tongue as she pushed it open. The house that sat back in the yard was little and old and weather-beaten. Its one-story frame had once been painted, but there was a memory remote and traditional. A straggling morning-glory strove to conceal its time-ravaged face. The little walk of broken bits of brick was reddened carefully, and the one little step was scrupulously yellow-washed, which denoted that the occupants were cleanly as well as religious. Manuela's timid knock was answered by a harsh "Entrez." It was a small, sombre room within, with a bare yellow washed floor and ragged curtains at the little window. In a corner was a diminutive altar draped with threadbare lace. The red glow of the taper lighted a cheap print of Saint Joseph and a brazen crucifix. The human element in the room was furnished by a little wizened yellow woman, who, black-robed, turbaned, and stern, sat before an uncertain table whereon were greasy cards. Manuela paused, her eyes blinking at the semi-obscurity within. The wizened one called in croaking tones, "And for why you come here? Asseyez-la, mamselle." Timidly Manuela sat at the table facing the owner of the voice. "I want," she began faintly, but the mistress of the cards understood. She had had much experience. The cards were shuffled in her long, grimy talons and stacked before Manuela. "Now you cut dem in three parts, so. Un, deux, trois, bien. You make you wish wid all your heart, bien. Yes, I see, I see." Breathlessly did Manuela learn that her lover was true. "But dat light gal, yes, she mek novena in Saint Roch for he's love." "I give you one little charm, yes," said the wizened one, when the séance was over, and Manuela, all white and nervous, leaned back in the rickety chair. "I give you one little charm for to wean him back, yes. You wear hid round your waist, and he come back. Den you make prayer at Saint Roch and burn candle. Den you come back and tell me yes. 50 sous, mamselle. Merci. Good luck go wid you." Readjusting her veil, Manuela passed out the little wicket gate, treading on air. Again the sun shone, and the breath of the swamps came as healthful sea breeze unto her nostrils. She fairly flew in the direction of Saint Roch. There were quite a number of persons entering the white gates of the cemetery, for this was Friday, when all those who wish good luck pray to the saint, and wash their steps promptly at 12 o'clock with a wondrous mixture to guard the house. Manuela bought a candle from the keeper of the little lodge at the entrance, and pausing one instant by the great sundial to see if the heavens and the hour were propitious, glided into the tiny chapel, dim and stifling with heavy air from myriad wish candles blazing on the wide table before the altar rail. She said her prayer, and lighting her candle, placed it with the others. "Mon Dieu, how brightly the sun seemed to shine now!" she thought, pausing at the door on her way out. Her small finger tips, still bedewed with holy water, rested caressingly on a gamin's head. The ivy which enfolds the quaint chapel never seemed so green. The shrines which serve as the way of the cross never seemed so artistic. The baby graves even seemed cheerful. Theophile called Sunday. Manuela's heart leaped. He had been spending his Sundays with Claralie. His stay was short, and he was plainly bored. But Manuela knelt to thank the good Saint Roch that night, and fondled the charm about her slim waist. There came a box of bonbons during the week, with a decorative card, all roses and fringe, from Theophile. But being a Creole, and therefore superstitiously careful, and having been reared by a wise and experienced maman to mistrust the gifts of a recreant lover, Manuela quietly thrust bonbon box and card into the kitchen fire, and the Friday following placed the second candle of her novena in Saint Roch. Those of Manuela's friends who had watched with indignation Theophile gallantly leading Claralie home from high mass on Sundays gasped with astonishment when the next Sunday, with his usual bow, the young man offered Manuela his arm as the worshippers filed out in step to the organ's march. Claralie tossed her head as she crossed herself with holy water, and the pink in her cheeks was brighter than usual. Manuela smiled a bright good morning when she met Claralie in Saint Roch the next Friday. The little blonde blushed furiously, and Manuela rushed post haste to the Wizened One to confer upon this new issue. "It ees good," said the dame, shaking her turbaned head. "She ees 'fraid she will work. May you charm, hit weel beat her." And Manuela departed with radiant eyes. Theophile was not at Mass Sunday morning, and murderous glances flashed from Claralie to Manuela before the tinkling of the host bell. Nor did Theophile call at either house. Two hearts beat furiously at the sound of every passing footstep, and two minds wondered if the other were enjoying the beloved one's smiles. Two pair of eyes, however, blue and black, smiled on others, and their owners laughed and seemed none the less happy. For your Creole girls are proud, and would die rather than let the world see their sorrows. Monday evening Theophile, the missing, showed his rather sheepish countenance in Manuela's parlour, and explained that he, with some chosen spirits, had gone for a trip over the lake. "I did not ask you where you were yesterday," replied the girl saucily. Theophile shrugged his shoulders and changed the conversation. The next week there was a birthday fete in honour of Louise, Theophile's young sister. Every one was bidden, and no one thought of refusing, for Louise was young, and this would be her first party. So, though the night was hot, the dancing went on as merrily as light young feet could make it go. Claralie fluffed her dainty white skirts and cast mischievous sparkles in the direction of Theophile, who with the maman and Louise was bravely trying not to look self-conscious. Manuela, tall and calm and proud-looking, in a cool, pale yellow gown, was apparently enjoying herself without paying the slightest attention to her young host. "Have I the pleasure of this dance?" he asked her finally, in a lull of the music. She bowed assent, and as if moved by a common impulse, they strolled out of the dancing-room into the cool, quaint garden, where jessamines gave out an overpowering perfume, and a caged mocking-bird complained melodiously to the full moon in the sky. It must have been an engrossing tete-a-tete, for the call to supper had sounded twice before they heard and hurried into the house. The march had formed with Louise radiantly leading on the arm of papa. Claralie tripped by with Léon. Of course, nothing remained for Theophile and Manuela to do but to bring up the rear, for which they received much good-natured chaffing. But when the party reached the dining-room, Theophile proudly led his partner to the head of the table, at the right hand of maman, and smiled benignly about at the delighted assemblage. Now, you know, when a Creole young man places a girl at his mother's right hand at his own table, there is but one conclusion to be deduced therefrom. If you had asked Manuela, after the wedding was over, how it happened, she would have said nothing, but looked wise. If you had asked Claralie, she would have laughed and said she always preferred Léon. If you had asked Theophile, he would have wondered that you thought he had ever meant more than to tease Manuela. If you had asked Wizened One, she would have offered you a charm. But Saint Roch knows, for he is a good saint, and if you believe in him, and are true and good, and make your novenas with a clean heart, he will grant your wish. End of section 1. Section 2 of The Goodness of Saint Roch and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tony's wife. "Give me 5 cents worth of candy, please." It was the little Jew girl who spoke, and Tony's wife roused herself from her knitting to rise and count out the multi-hued candy which should go in exchange for the dingy nickel grasped in warm, damp fingers. 3 long sticks, carefully wrapped in crispest brown paper, and a half-dozen or more of pink candy fish for lagniappe, and the little Jew girl sped away in blissful contentment. Tony's wife resumed her knitting with a stifled sigh until the next customer should come. A low growl caused her to look up apprehensively. Tony himself stood beetle-browed and huge in the small doorway. "Get up from there," he muttered, "and open 2 dozen oysters right away. The Elliots want 'em." His English was unaccented. It was long since he had seen Italy. She moved meekly behind the counter and began work on the thick shells. Tony stretched his long neck up the street. "Mr. Tony, mamma wants some charcoal." The very small voice at his feet must have pleased him, for his black brows relaxed into a smile, and he poked the little one's chin with a hard, dirty finger as he emptied the ridiculously small bucket of charcoal into the child's bucket, and gave a banana for lagniappe. The crackling of shells went on behind, and a stifled sob arose as a bit of sharp edge cut into the thin, worn fingers that clasped the knife. "Hurry up there, will you?" growled the black brows. "The Elliots are sending for the oysters." She deftly strained and counted them, and after wiping her fingers resumed her seat and took up the endless crochet work with her usual stifled sigh. Tony and his wife had always been in this same little queer old shop on Prytania Street, at least to the memory of the oldest inhabitant in the neighbourhood. When or how they came, or how they stayed, no one knew. It was enough that they were there, like a sort of ancestral fixture to the street. The neighbourhood was fine enough to look down upon these 2 tumble-down shops at the corner, kept by Tony and Mrs. Murphy, the grocer. It was a semi-fashionable locality, far uptown, away from the old-time French Quarter. It was the sort of neighbourhood where millionaires live before their fortunes are made, and fashionable, high-priced private schools flourish, where the small cottages are occupied by aspiring school-teachers and choir-singers. Such was this locality, and you must admit that it was indeed a condescension to tolerate Tony and Mrs. Murphy. He was a great, black-bearded, hoarse-voiced, 6-foot specimen of Italian humanity, who looked in his little shop and on the prosaic pavement of Prytania Street somewhat as Hercules might seem in a modern drawing-room. You instinctively thought of wild mountain passes and the gleaming dirks of bandit contadini in looking at him. What his last name was no one knew. Someone had maintained once that he had been christened Antonio Malatesta, but that was unauthentic, and as little to be believed as that other wild theory that her name was Mary. She was meek, pale, little, ugly, and German. Altogether, part of his arms and legs would have very decently made another larger than she. Her hair was pale, and drawn in sleek, thin tightness away from a pinched, pitiful face, whose dull, cold eyes hurt you because you knew they were trying to mirror sorrow, and could not because of their expressionless quality. No matter what the weather or what her other toilet, she always wore a thin little shawl of dingy brick-dust hue about her shoulders. No matter what the occasion or what the day, she always carried her knitting with her, and seldom ceased the incessant twist of the shining steel among the white cotton meshes. She might put down the needles and lace into the spool-box long enough to open oysters, or wrap up fruit and candy, or count out wood and coal into infinitesimal portions, or do her housework. But the knitting was snatched with avidity at the first spare moment, and the worn, white, blue-marked fingers, half enclosed in kid-glove stalls for protection, would writhe and twist in and out again. Little girls just learning to crochet borrowed their patterns from Tony's wife, and it was considered quite a mark of advancement to have her inspect a bit of lace done by eager, chubby fingers. The ladies in larger houses, whose husbands would be millionaires some day, bought her lace and gave it to their servants for Christmas presents. As for Tony, when she was slow in opening his oysters or in cooking his red beans and spaghetti, he roared at her, and prefixed picturesque adjectives to her lace, which made her hide it under her apron with a fearsome look in her dull eyes. He hated her in a lusty, roaring fashion, as a healthy, beefy boy hates a sick cat and torments it to madness. When she displeased him, he beat her and knocked her frail form on the floor. The children could tell when this had happened. Her eyes would be red, and there would be blue marks on her face and neck. "Poor Mrs. Tony," they would say, and nestle close to her. Tony did not roar at her for petting them, perhaps because they spent money on the multi-hued candy in glass jars on the shelves. Her mother appeared upon the scene once and stayed a short time, but Tony got drunk one day and beat her because she ate too much, and she disappeared soon after. Whence she came and where she departed, no one could tell, not even Mrs. Murphy, the Pauline Pry and Gazette of the block. Tony had gout, and suffered for many days in roaring helplessness, the while his foot, bound and swathed in many folds of red flannel, lay on the chair before him. In proportion as his gout increased and he bawled from pure physical discomfort, she became light-hearted and moved about the shop with real brisk cheeriness. He could not hit her then without such pain that after one or two trials he gave up in disgust. So the dull years had passed, and life had gone on pretty much the same for Tony and the German wife and the shop. The children came on Sunday evenings to buy the stick candy, and on weekdays for coal and wood. The servants came to buy oysters for the larger houses, and to gossip over the counter about their employers. The little dry woman knitted, and the big man moved lazily in and out in his red flannel shirt, exchanged politics with the tailor next door through the window, or lounged into Mrs. Murphy's bar and drank fiercely. Some of the children grew up and moved away, and other little girls came to buy candy and eat pink lignop fishes, and the shop still thrived. One day Tony was ill, more than the mummied foot of gout, or the wheeze of asthma. He must keep his bed and send for the doctor. She clutched his arm when he came, and pulled him into the tiny room. Is it anything much, doctor?" she gasped. Aesculapius shook his head as wisely as the occasion would permit. She followed him out of the room into the shop. Will he get well, doctor?" Aesculapius buttoned up his frock coat, smoothed his shining hat, cleared his throat, then replied oracularly, "Madam, he is completely burned out inside. Empty as a shell, madam, empty as a shell. He cannot live, for he has nothing to live on." As the cobble-stones rattled under the doctor's equipage, rolling leisurely up Prytania Street, Tony's wife sat in her chair and laughed with a hearty joyousness that lifted the film from the dull eyes and disclosed a sparkle beneath. The drear days went by, and Tony lay like a veritable Samson, shorn of his strength, for his voice was sunken to a hoarse, sibilant whisper, and his black eyes gazed fiercely from the shock of hair and beard about a white face. Life went on pretty much as before in the shop. The children paused to ask how Mr. Tony was, and even hushed the jingles on their bell hoops as they passed the door. Red-headed Jimmy, Mrs. Murphy's nephew, did the hard jobs, such as splitting wood and lifting coal from the bin, and in the intervals between tending the fallen giant and waiting on the customers, Tony's wife sat in her accustomed chair, knitting fiercely with an inscrutable smile about her purple, compressed mouth. Then John came, introducing himself serpent-wise into the Eden of her bosom. John was Tony's brother, huge and bluff too, but fair and blond, with the beauty of northern Italy. With the same lack of race pride which Tony had displayed in selecting his German spouse, John had taken unto himself Betty, a daughter of Erin, aggressive, powerful, and cross-eyed. He turned up now, having heard of this illness, and assumed an air of remarkable authority at once. A hunted look stole into the dull eyes, and after John had departed with blustering directions as to Tony's welfare, she crept to his bedside timidly. "Tony," she said, "Tony, you are very sick. An inarticulate growl was the only response. "Tony, you ought to see the priest. You mustn't go any longer without taking the sacrament." The growl deepened into words. "Don't want any priest. You're always after some snivelling old woman's fuss. You and Mrs. Murphy go on with your church. It won't make you any better." She shivered under this parting shot, and crept back into the shop. Still the priest came next day. She followed him into the bedside, and knelt timidly. "Tony," she whispered, "here's Father Leblanc." Tony was too languid to curse out loud. He only expressed his hate in a toss of the black beard and shaggy mane. "Tony," she said nervously, "won't you do it now? It won't take long, and it will be better for you when you go. Oh, Tony, don't laugh, please, Tony. Here's the priest." But the Titan roared aloud. "No, get out. Think I'm a goin' to give you a chance to grab my money now? Let me die and go to hell in peace." Father Leblanc knelt meekly and prayed, and the woman's weak pleadings continued. "Tony, I've been true and good and faithful to you. Don't die and leave me no better than before. Tony, I do want to be a good woman once, a real for true married woman. Tony, here's the priest. Say yes." And she wrung her ringless hands. "You want my money," said Tony slowly, "and you shan't have it, not a cent. John shall have it." Father Leblanc shrank away like a fading spectre. He came next day and next day, only to see reenacted the same piteous scene, the woman pleading to be made a wife, ere death hushed Tony's blasphemies, the man chuckling in pain-racked glee at the prospect of her bereaved misery. Not all the prayers of Father Leblanc, nor the wailings of Mrs. Murphy, could alter the determination of the will beneath the shock of hair. He gloated in his physical weakness at the tenacious grasp on his mentality. "Tony," she wailed on the last day, her voice rising to a shriek in its eagerness, "tell them I'm your wife. It'll be the same. Only say it, Tony, before you die." He raised his head and turned stiff eyes and gibbering mouth on her, then with one chill finger pointing at John, fell back dully and heavily. They buried him with many honours by the Society of Italia's Sons. John took possession of the shop when they returned home, and found the money hidden in the chimney corner. As for Tony's wife, since she was not his wife after all, they sent her forth in the world penniless, her worn fingers clutching her bundle of clothes in nervous agitation, as though they regretted the time lost from knitting. End of section 2. Section 3 of the Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fisherman of Pass, Christian. The swift breezes on the beach at Pass, Christian, meet and conflict as though each strove for the mastery of the air. The land breeze blows down through the pines, resinous, fragrant, cold, bringing breath-like memories of dim, dark woods, shaded by myriad pine needles. The breeze from the Gulf is warm and soft and languorous, blowing up from the south with its suggestion of tropical warmth and passion. It is strong and masterful, and tossed Annette's hair and whipped her skirts about her in bold disregard for the proprieties. Arm in arm with Philip, she was strolling slowly down the great pier, which extends from the Mexican Gulf Hotel into the waters of the Sound. There was no moon to-night, but the sky glittered and scintillated with myriad stars, brighter than you can ever see farther north, and the great waves that the Gulf breeze tossed up in restless profusion gleamed with the white fire of phosphorescent flame. The wet sands on the beach glowed white fire. The posts of the pier, where the waves had leaped and left a laughing kiss, the sides of the little boats and fish cars, tugging at their ropes, alike showed white and flaming, as though the sea and all it touched were afire. Annette and Philip paused midway the pier to watch two fishermen casting their nets. With heads bared to the breeze, they stood in clear silhouette against the white background of sea. "See how he uses his teeth," almost whispered Annette, drawing himself up to his full height, with one end of the huge seine between his teeth and the cord in his left hand. The taller fisherman of the two paused a half instant, his right arm extended, grasping the folds of the net. There was a swishing rush through the air, and it settled with a sort of sob as it cut the waters and struck a million sparkles of fire from the waves. Then, with backs bending under the strain, the two men swung on the cord, drawing in the net, laden with glittering, restless fish, which were unceremoniously dumped on the boards to be put into the fish car awaiting them. Philip laughingly picked up a soft, gleaming jelly-fish and threatened to put it on Annette's neck. She screamed, ran, slipped on the wet boards, and in another instant would have fallen over into the water below. The tall fisherman caught her in his arms and set her on her feet. "Mademoiselle must be very careful," he said in the softest and most correct French. "The tide is in, and the water very rough. It would be very difficult to swim out there to-night." Annette murmured confused thanks, which were supplemented by Philip's hearty tones. She was silent until they reached the pavilion at the end of the pier. The semi-darkness was unrelieved by lantern or light. The strong wind wafted the strains from a couple of mandolins, a guitar, and a tenor voice stationed in one corner to sundry engrossed couples in sundry other corners. Philip found an untenanted nook, and they ensconced themselves therein. "Do you know there's something mysterious about that fisherman?" said Annette, during a lull in the wind. "Because he did not let you go over?" inquired Philip. "No," he spoke correctly, and with the accent that goes only with an excellent education. Philip shrugged his shoulders. "That's nothing remarkable. If you stay about Pass Christian for any length of time, you'll find more things than perfect French and courtly grace among fishermen to surprise you. These are a wonderful people who live across the lake." Annette was lolling in the hammock under the big catalpa tree some days later, when the gate opened and Natalie's big sunbonnet appeared. Natalie herself was discovered, blushing in its dainty depths. She was only a little Creole seaside girl, you must know, and very shy of the city demoiselles. Natalie's patois was quite as different from Annette's French as it was from the postmaster's English. "Mees Annette," she began, peony-hued all over at her own boldness, "we will have one li'l hayride this night, and a fish fry at the end. Will you come?" Annette sprang to her feet in delight. "Will I come? Certainly. How delightful! You are so good to ask me. What time?" But Natalie's pink bonnet had fled precipitately down the shaded walk. Annette laughed joyously as Philip lounged down the gallery. "I frightened the child away," she told him. "You've never been for a hayride and fish fry on the shores of the Mississippi Sound, have you? When the summer boarders and the northern visitors undertake to give one, it is a comparatively staid affair, where due regard is had for one's wearing apparel, and where there are servants to do the hardest work. Then it isn't enjoyable at all. But when the natives, the boys and girls who live there, make up their minds to have fun, you may depend upon its being just the best kind." This time there were 20 boys and girls, a mamma or so, several papas, and a grizzled fisherman to restrain the ardor of the amateurs. The cart was vast and solid, and 2 comfortable, sleeping-looking mules constituted the drawing power. There were also tin horns, some guitars, an accordion, and a quartet of much praised voices. The hay in the bottom of the wagon was freely mixed with pine needles, whose prickiness through your hose was amply compensated for by its delicious fragrance. After a triumphantly noisy passage down the beach, one comes to the stretch of heavy sand that lies between Pass Christian proper and Henderson's Point. This is a hard pull for the mules, and the more ambitious riders get out and walk. Then, after a final strain through the shifting sands, bravo, the shell road is reached, and one goes cheering through the pine trees to Henderson's Point. If ever you go to Pass Christian, you must have a fish fry at Henderson's Point. It is the pine-thicketed, white-beached peninsula jutting out from the land, with one side caressed by the waters of the Sound, and the other purred over by the blue waves of the Bay of St. Louis. Here is the beginning of the great 3-mile trestle bridge to the town of Bay St. Louis, and tonight from the beach could be seen the lights of the villas glittering across the bay like myriads of unsleeping eyes. Here upon a firm stretch of white sand camped the merry-makers. Soon a great fire of driftwood and pine cones tossed its flames defiantly at a radiant moon in the sky, and the fishers were casting their nets in the sea. The more daring of the girls waded bare-legged in the water, holding pine torches, spearing flounders, and peering for soft-shell crabs. Annette had wandered farther in the shallow water than the rest. Suddenly she stumbled against a stone. The torch dropped and spluttered at her feet. With a little helpless cry, she looked at the stretch of unfamiliar beach and water to find herself all alone. "Pardon me, mademoiselle," said a voice at her elbow. "You are in distress?" It was her fisherman, and with a scarce conscious sigh of relief, Annette put her hand into the outstretched one at her side. "I was looking for soft shells," she explained, "and lost the crowd, and now my torch is out." "Where is the crowd?" There was some amusement in the tone, and Annette glanced up quickly, prepared to be thoroughly indignant at this fisherman who dared make fun at her. But there was such a kindly look about his mouth that she was reassured, and said meekly, "At Henderson's Point." "You have wandered a half-mile away," he mused, "and have nothing to show for your pains but very wet skirts. If mademoiselle will permit me, I will take her to her friends, but allow me to suggest that mademoiselle will leave the water and walk on the sands." "But I am barefoot," wailed Annette, "and I'm afraid of the fiddlers." "Fiddler crabs, you know, aren't pleasant things to be dangling around one's bare feet, and they are more numerous than sand fleas down at Henderson's Point." "True," assented the fisherman. "Then we shall have to wade back." The fishing was over when they rounded the point and came in sight of the cheery bonfire with its Rembrandt-like group, and the air was savory with the smell of frying fish and crabs. The fisherman was not to be tempted by appeals to stay, but smilingly disappeared down the sands, the red glare of his torch making a glowing track in the water. "Ah, Mees Annette," whispered Nathalie, between mouthfuls of a rich croaker, "you have found a beau in the water." "And the fisherman of the past, too," laughed her cousin Ida. Annette tossed her head, for Philip had growled audibly. "Do you know, Philip," cried Annette a few days after, rudely shaking him from his siesta on the gallery, "do you know that I have found my fisherman's hut?" "Hum," was the only response. "Yes, and it's the quaintest, most delightful spot imaginable. Philip, do come with me and see it." "Hum." "Oh, Philip, you are so lazy. Do come with me." "Yes, but my dear Annette," protested Philip, "this is a warm day, and I am tired." Still, his curiosity being aroused, he went grumbling. It was not a very long drive back from the beach, across the railroad, and through the pine forest to the bank of a dark, slow-flowing bayou. The fisherman's hut was small, 2-roomed, whitewashed, pine-boarded, with the traditional mud chimney acting as a sort of support to one of its uneven sides. Within was a weird assortment of curios from every uncivilized part of the globe. Also were there fishing tackle and guns in reckless profusion. The fisherman in the kitchen of the mud chimney was sardonically waging war with a basket of little bayou crabs. "Entrez, mademoiselle et monsieur," he said pleasantly, grabbing a vicious crab by its flippers and smiling at its wild attempts to bite. "You see I am busy, but make yourself at home." "Well, how on earth—" began Philip. "Sh, sh," whispered Annette. "I was driving out in the woods this morning and stumbled on the hut. He asked me in, but I came right over after you." The fisherman, having succeeded in getting the last crab in the kettle of boiling water, came forward smiling and began to explain the curios. "Then you have not always lived at Pass Christian?" said Philip. "Mais non, monsieur. I'm spending a summer here." "And he spends his winters doubtless selling fish in the French market," spitefully soliloquized Philip. The fisherman was looking unutterable things into Annette's eyes, and it seemed to Philip taking an unconscionably long time explaining the use of an East Indian stiletto. "Oh, wouldn't it be delightful?" came from Annette at last. "What?" asked Philip. "Why, Monsieur le Comte says he'll take 6 of us out in his catboat to-morrow for a fishing trip on the Gulf." "Hum," dryly. "And I'll get Natalie and her cousins." "Yes," still more dryly. Annette chattered on, entirely oblivious of the strainedness of the men's adieu, and still chattered as they drove through the pines. "I did not know that you were going to take fishermen and marchands into the bosom of your social set when you came here," growled Philip at last. "But, cousin Phil, can't you see he is a gentleman? The fact that he makes no excuses or protestations is a proof." "You are a fool," was the polite response. Still, at 6 o'clock next morning there was a little crowd of 7 upon the pier, laughing and chatting at the little Virginie, dipping her bows in the water and flapping her sails in the brisk wind. Natalie's pink bonnet blushed in the early sunshine, and Natalie's mamma, comely and portly, did chaperonage duty. It was not long before the sails gave swell into the breeze, and the little boat scurried to the sound. Past the lighthouse on its gawky iron stalls she flew, and now rounded the white sands of Cat Island. "Bravo, the Gulf!" sang a voice on the lookout. The little boat dipped, halted an instant, and rushed fast into the blue Gulf waters. "We will anchor here," said the host. "Have luncheon and fish." Philip could not exactly understand why the fisherman should sit so close to Annette and whisper so much into her ears. He chafed at her acting the part of hostess, and was possessed of a murderous desire to throw the pink sunbonnet and its owner into the sea, when Natalie whispered audibly to one of her cousins that "Mees Annette act nice wid her lavar." The sun was banking up flaming pillars of rose and gold in the west when the little Virginie rounded Cat Island on her way home, and the quick southern twilight was fast dying into darkness when she was tied up to the pier, and the merry makers sprang off with baskets of fish. Annette had distinguished herself by catching one small shark, and had immediately ceased to fish and devoted her attention to her fisherman and his line. Philip had angled fiercely, landing trout, croakers, sheep's head, snappers, and bewildering luck. He had broken each hopeless captive's neck savagely, as though they were personal enemies. He did not look happy as they landed, though paeans of praise were being sung in his honour. As the days passed on, the fishermen of the pass began to dance attendance on Annette. What had seemed a joke became serious. Aunt Nina, urged by Philip, remonstrated, and even the mamma of the pink sunbonnet began to look grave. It was all very well for a city demoiselle to talk with a fisherman and accept favours at his hands, provided that the city demoiselle understood that a vast and bridgeless gulf stretched between her and the fisherman. But when the damoiselle forgot the gulf and the fisherman refused to recognize it, why, it was time to take matters in hand. To all of Aunt Nina's remonstrances, Philip's growlings, and the averted glances of her companions, Annette was deaf. "You are narrow-minded," she said laughingly. "I'm interested in Monsieur le Comte simply as a study. He is entertaining. He talks well of his travels. And as for refusing to recognize the difference between us, why, he never dreamed of such a thing." Suddenly a peremptory summons home from Annette's father put an end to the fears of Philip. Annette pouted, but papa must be obeyed. She blamed Philip and Aunt Nina for telling tales, but Aunt Nina was uncommunicative, and Philip, too, obviously cheerful to derive much satisfaction from. That night she walked with the fisherman, hand in hand, on the sands. The wind from the pines bore the scarcely recognizable subtle freshness of early autumn, and the waters had a hint of dying summer in their sob on the beach. "You will remember," said the fisherman, "that I have told you nothing about myself." "Yes," murmured Annette. "And you will keep your promises to me?" "Yes." "Let me hear you repeat them again." "I promise you that I will not forget you. I promise you that I will never speak of you to any one until I see you again. I promise that I will then clasp your hand wherever you may be." "And mademoiselle will not be discouraged, but will continue her studies?" "Yes." It was all very romantic. By the waves of the Sound, under a harvest moon that seemed all sympathy for these two, despite the fact that it was probably looking down upon hundreds of other equally romantic couples, Annette went to bed with glowing cheeks, and a heart whose pulsations would have caused a physician to prescribe unlimited digitalis. It was still hot in New Orleans when she returned home, and it seemed hard to go immediately to work. But if one is going to be an opera singer some day, and capture the world with one's voice, there is nothing to do but to study, sing, practise, even though one's throat be parched, one's head a great ache, and one's heart a nest of discouragement and sadness at what seems the uselessness of it all. Annette had now a new incentive to work. The fisherman had once praised her voice when she hummed a barcarolle on the sands, and he had insisted that there was power in its rich notes. Though the fisherman had showed no cause why he should be accepted as a musical critic, Annette had somehow respected his judgment, and been accordingly elated. It was the night of the opening of the opera. There was the usual crush, the glitter and confusing radiance of the brilliant audience. Annette, with papa, Aunt Nina, and Philip, was late reaching her box. The curtain was up, and La Juive was pouring forth defiance at her angry persecutors. Annette listened breathlessly. In fancy she too was ringing her voice out to an applauding house. Her head unconsciously beat time to the music, and one hand half held her cloak from her bare shoulders. Then Eleazar appeared, and the house rose at the end of his song. Encores it gave, and bravos and cheers. He bowed calmly, swept his eyes over the tiers until they found Annette, where they rested in a half smile of recognition. "Philip," gasped Annette, nervously raising her glasses. "My fisherman." "Yes, an opera singer is better than a marchand," drawled Philip. The curtain fell on the first act. The house was won by the new tenor. It called and recalled him before the curtain. Clearly he had sung his way into the hearts of his audience at once. "Papa, Aunt Nina," said Annette, "you must come behind the scenes with me. I want you to meet him. He is delightful. You must come." Philip was bending ostentatiously over the girl in the next box. Papa and Aunt Nina consented to be dragged behind the scenes. Annette was well known, for, in hopes of some day being an occupant of one of the dressing rooms, she had made friends with every one connected with the opera. Eleazar received them, still wearing his brown garb and patriarchal beard. "How you deceived me!" she laughed when the greetings and introductions were over. "I came to America early," he smiled back at her, "and thought I'd try a little incognito at the pass. I was not well, you see. It has been of great benefit to me." "I kept my promise," she said in a lower tone. "Thank you. That also has helped me." Annette's teacher began to note a wonderful improvement in his pupil's voice. Never did a girl study so hard or practise so faithfully. It was truly wonderful. Now and then Annette would say to papa, as if to reassure herself, "And when Monsieur Sherbard says I'm ready to go to Paris, I may go, papa?" And papa would say, "Certainly." That would send her back to the piano with renewed ardor. As for Monsieur le Comte, he was the idol of New Orleans. Seldom had there been a tenor who had sung himself so completely into the very hearts of a populace. When he was billed, the opera displayed standing-room signs, no matter what the other attractions in the city might be. Sometimes Monsieur le Comte delighted small audiences in Annette's parlor, when the hostess was in a perfect flutter of happiness. Not often, you know, for the leading tenor was in great demand at the homes of society queens. "Do you know," said Annette petulantly one evening, "I wish for the old days at Pass Christian." "So do I," he answered tenderly. "Will you repeat them with me next summer?" "If I only could!" she gasped. Still she might have been happy had it not been for Madame Dubose. Madame Dubose, the flute-voiced leading soprano, who wore the single dainty curl on her forehead, and thrilled her audiences oft-times more completely than the fisherman. Madame Dubose was La Juive to his Eleazar, Leonore to his Manfred, Elsa to his Lohengrin, Aida to his Rodam's, Marguerite to his Faust. In brief, Madame Dubose was his opposite. She caressed him as Mignon, pleaded with him as Machiavel, died for him in Les Huguenots, broke her heart for love of him in La Favorite. How could he help but love her? Annette asked herself, how could he? Madame Dubose was beautiful and gifted and charming. Once she whispered her fears to him when there was the meagrest bit of an opportunity. He laughed. "You don't understand, little one," he said tenderly. "The relations of professional people to each other are peculiar. After you go to Paris you will know." Still New Orleans had built up its romance, and gossiped accordingly. "Have you heard the news?" whispered Lola to Annette, leaning from her box at the opera one night. The curtain had just gone up on Herodias, and for some reason or other the audience applauded with more warmth than usual. There was a noticeable number of good-humoured, benignant smiles on the faces of the applauders. "No," answered Annette, breathlessly. "No, indeed, Lola. I'm going to Paris next week. I'm so delighted I can't stop to think." "Yes, that is excellent," said Lola, "but all New Orleans is smiling at the romance. Monsieur le Comte and Madame Dubose were quietly married last night, but it leaked out this afternoon. See all the applause she's receiving." Annette leaned back in her chair, very white and still. Her box was empty after the first act, and a quiet little tired voice, that was almost too faint to be heard in the carriage on the way home, said, "Papa, I don't think I care to go to Paris after all." End of Section 3. Section 4 of the Goodness of Saint Rocque and Other Stories, by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Monsieur Fortier's violin. Slowly, one by one, the lights in the French opera go out, until there is but a single glimmer of pale yellow flickering in the great dark space, a few moments ago all aglitter with jewels and the radiance of womanhood, and a clash with music. Darkness now, and silence, and a great haunted hush over all, save for the distant cheery voice of a stage hand humming a bar of the opera. The glimmer of gas makes a halo about the bowed white head of a little old man, putting his violin carefully away in its case with aged, trembling, nervous fingers. Old Monsieur Fortier was the last one out every night. Outside, the air was murky, foggy. Gas and electricity were but faint splotches of light on the thick curtain of fog and mist. Around the opera was a mighty bustle of carriages and drivers, and footmen with a car gaining headway in the street now and then, a howling of names and numbers, the laughter and small talk of cloaked society stepping slowly to its carriages, and the more bourgeoisie vocalization of the foot passengers who streamed along and hummed little bits of music. The fog's denseness was confusing, too, and at one moment it seemed that the little narrow street would become inextricably choked, and remain so until some mighty engine would blow the crowd into atoms. It had been a crowded night. From around Toulouse Street, where led the entrance to the troisième, from the grand stairway, from the entrance to the quatrième. The human stream poured into the street, nearly all with a song on their lips. Monsieur Fortier stood at the corner, blinking at the beautiful ladies in their carriages. He exchanged a hearty salutation with the saloon-keeper at the corner. Then, tenderly carrying his violin case, he trudged down Bourbon Street, a little old, bent, withered figure, with shoulders shrugged up to keep warm, as though the faded brown overcoat were not thick enough. Down on Bayeux Road, not so far from Claiborne Street, was a house, little and old and queer, but quite large enough to hold Monsieur Fortier, a wrinkled dame, and a white cat. He was home but little, for on nearly every day there were rehearsals. Then on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights, and twice Sundays, there were performances. So Ma'am Jean and the white cat kept house almost always alone. Then, when Monsieur Fortier was at home, why, it was practice all the day, and smoke, snore, sleep at night. Altogether it was not very exhilarating. Monsieur Fortier had played first violin in the orchestra ever since. Well, no one remembered his not playing there. Sometimes there would come breaks in the seasons, and for a year the great building would be dark and silent. Then Monsieur Fortier would do jobs of playing here and there, one night for this ball, another night for that soirée dansant, and in the day work at his trade, that of a cigar maker. But now for 7 years there had been no break in the season, and the little old violinist was happy. There is nothing sweeter than a regular job, and good music to play, music into which one can put some soul, some expression, and which one must study to understand. Dance music of the frivolous, frothy kind deemed essential to soirees is trivial, easy, uninteresting. So Monsieur Fortier, Ma'am Jean, and the white cat lived a peaceful, uneventful existence out on Bayeux Road. When the opera season was over in February, Monsieur went back to cigar-making, and the white cat purred none the less contentedly. It had been a benefit tonight for the leading tenor, and he had chosen Roland à Roncevaux, a favorite this season, for his farewell. And mon Dieu, mused the little Monsieur, but how his voice had rung out, bell-like, piercing, above the chorus of the first act. Encore after encore was given, and the bravos of the troisième were enough to stir the most sluggish of pulses. Superbe Pyrénées, qui dressez dans le ciel vos crimes couronnés d'un hiver éternel, pour nous livrer passage, ouvrez vos larges flancs, faites vers l'orage, voici venir les Francs. Monsieur quickened his pace down Bourbon Street as he sang the chorus to himself in a thin old voice, and then before he could see in the thick fog he had run into two young men. I beg your pardon, monsieur," he stammered. "Most certainly," was the careless response. Then the speaker, taking a second glance at the object of the rencontre, cried joyfully, "Oh, Monsieur Fortier, is it you? Well, you are so happy, singing your love sonnet to your lady's eyebrow, that you didn't see a thing but the moon, did you? And who is the fair one who should clog your senses so?" There was a deprecating shrug from the little man. "Ma foi, but monsieur must know for sure that I am too old for love songs." "I know nothing save that I want that violin of yours. When is it to be mine, Monsieur Fortier?" "Never, never!" exclaimed Monsieur, gripping on as tightly to the case as if he feared it might be wrenched from him. "Mais à l'envers, and to sell mon violon à sauver foolish." "Martel," said the first speaker to his companion as they moved on uptown, "I wish you knew that little Frenchman. He's a unique specimen. He has the most exquisite violin I've seen in years, beautiful and mellow as a genuine Cremona, and he can make the music leap, sing, laugh, sob, skip, wail, anything you like from under his bow when he wishes. It's something wonderful. We are good friends. Picked him up in my Frenchtown rambles. I've been trying to buy that instrument since." "To throw it aside a week later?" lazily inquired Martel. You are like the rest of these 19th century vandals. You can see nothing picturesque that you do not wish to deface for a souvenir. You cannot even let simple happiness alone, but must needs destroy it in a vain attempt to make it your own, or parade it as an advertisement. As for Monsieur Fortier, he went right on with his song, and turned into Bayou Road, his shoulders still shrugged high as though he were cold, and into the quaint little house, where Mame Jean and the white cat, who always waited up for him at nights, were both nodding over the fire. It was not long after this that the opera closed, and Monsieur went back to his old out-of-season job. But somehow he did not do as well this spring and summer as always. There is a certain amount of cunning and finesse required to roll a cigar just so that Monsieur seemed to be losing, whether from age or deterioration. It was hard to tell. Nevertheless, there was just about half as much money coming in as formerly, and the quaint little pucker between Monsieur's eyebrows, which served for a frown, came oftener and stayed longer than ever before. "Manesse," he said one day to the white cat. He told all his troubles to her. It was of no use to talk to Mame Jean. She was too deaf to understand. "Manesse, we are gittin' po'. You, père, get hold, and his hands dey go no mo' rapidement, and there be no more soirée dese day. Manesse, if la saison don't hurry up, we shall eat very little meat." And Manesse curled her tail and purred. Before the summer had fairly begun, strange rumors began to float about in musical circles. Monsieur Moge would no longer manage the opera, but he would be turned into the hands of Americans, a syndicate. Bah! These English-speaking people could do nothing unless there was a trust, a syndicate, a company immense and dishonest. It was going to be a guarantee business with a strictly financial basis. But worse than all this, the new manager, who was now in France, would not only procure the artists, but a new orchestra, a new leader. Monsieur Fortier grew apprehensive at this, for he knew what the loss of his place would mean to him. September and October came, and the papers were filled with accounts of the new artist from France and of the new orchestra leader too. He was described as a most talented, progressive, energetic young man. Monsieur Fortier's heart sank at the word progressive. He was anything but that. The New Orleans Creole blood flowed too sluggishly in his old veins. November came. The opera reopened. Monsieur Fortier was not re-engaged. "Manesse," he said with a catch in his voice that strongly resembled a sob, "Manesse, we must go hongry sometime. Ah, mon pauvre violon! Ah, mon Dieu, dey put us out, and dey will not have us. Never mind, we will sing anyhow." And drawing his bow across the strings, he sang in his thin, quavering voice, "Salut d'amour, chaise de pure." It is strange what a peculiar power of fascination former haunts have for the human mind. The criminal, after he has fled from justice, steals back and skulks about the scene of his crime. The employee thrown from work hangs about the place of his former industry. The schoolboy truant or expelled peeps in at the school gate and taunts the good boys within. Monsieur Fortier was no exception. Night after night of the performances he climbed the stairs of the opera and sat, an attentive listener to the orchestra, with one ear inclined to the stage, and a quizzical expression on his wrinkled face. Then he would go home and pat Manesse and fondle the violin. "Ah, Manesse, dose new player, not one bit can dey play. Such tones, Manesse, such tones, all the time. Portamento, oh, so very bad. Ah, mon cher violon, we can play." And he would play and sing a romance and smile tenderly to himself. At first it used to be into the deuxième that Monsieur Fortier went, into the front seats, but soon they were too expensive, and after all, one could hear just as well in the fourth row as in the first. After a while, even the rear row of the deuxième was too costly, and the little musician wended his way with the plebeians around on Toulouse Street, and climbed the long, tedious flight of stairs into the troisième. It makes no difference to be one row higher. It was more to the liking, after all. One felt more at home up here among the people. If one was thirsty, one could drink a glass of wine or beer, being passed about by the libretto boys, and the music sounded just as well. But it happened one night that Monsieur could not even afford to climb the Toulouse Street stairs. To be sure, there was yet another gallery, the Quatrième, where the peanut boys went for a dime, but Monsieur could not get down to that yet, so he stayed outside until all the beautiful women in their warm wraps, a bright-hued, chattering throng, came down the grand staircase to their carriages. It was on one of these nights that Courset and Martel found him shivering at the corner. "Hello, Monsieur Fortier," cried Courset. "Are you ready to let me have that violin yet?" "For shame," interrupted Martel. $50, you know," continued Courset, taking no heed of his friend's interpolation. Monsieur Fortier made a courtly bow. "If Monsieur will call at my house on the morrow, he may have mon violon," he said huskily, then turned abruptly on his heel and went down Bourbon Street, his shoulders drawn high as though he were cold. When Courset and Martel entered the gate of the little house on Bayou Road the next day, there floated out to their ears a wordless song thrilling from the violin, a song that told more than speech or tears or gestures could have done of the utter sorrow and desolation of the little old man. They walked softly up the short red brick walk and tapped at the door. Within, Monsieur Fortier was caressing the violin, with silent tears streaming down his wrinkled gray face. There was not much said on either side. Courset came away with the instrument, leaving the money behind, while Martel grumbled at the essentially sordid, mercenary spirit of the world. Monsieur Fortier turned back into the room, after bowing his visitors out with old-time French courtliness, and turning to the sleepy white cat, said with a dry sob, "Ménesse, there's only me and you now." About 6 days later, Courset's morning dreams were disturbed by the announcement of a visitor. Hastily doing a toilette, he descended the stairs to find Monsieur Fortier nervously pacing the hall floor. "I come for bring back your money, yes. I cannot sleep, I cannot eat. I only cry and tink and weesh for mon violon. And Maness and de old woman too, dey mope and look bad too, all for mon violon. I try for to use dat money, but e burn and sting like blood money. I feel like I done sold my child. I cannot go at l'opera no mo. I tink of mon violon. I starve before I live without. My heart, he is broke. I die for mon violon." Courset left the room and returned with the instrument. "Monsieur Fortier," he said, bowing low as he handed the case to the little man, "take your violin. It was a whim with me, a passion with you. And as for the money, why, keep that too. It was worth $100 to have possessed such an instrument, even for 6 days." End of Section 4. Section 5 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. By the Bayou St. John. The Bayou St. John slowly makes its dark-hued way through reeds and rushes, high banks and flat slopes, until it casts itself into the turbulent bosom of Lake Pontchartrain. It is dark like the passionate women of Egypt, placid like their broad brows, deep, silent like their souls. Within its bosom are hidden romances and stories, such as were sung by minstrels of old. From the source to the mouth is not far distant, visibly speaking, but in the life of the bayou 100 heart miles could scarce measure it. Just where it winds about the northwest of the city are some of its most beautiful bits, orange groves on one side and quaint old Spanish gardens on the other. Who cares that the bridges are modern, and that here and there pert boathouses rear their prim heads? It is the bayou, even though it be invaded with the ruthless vandalism of the improving idea. And can a boathouse kill the beauty of a moss-grown centurion of an oak with a history as old as the city? Can an iron bridge with tarantula piers detract from the song of a mockingbird in a fragrant orange grove? We know that farther out, past the Confederate soldiers' home, that rose-embowered, brambling place of grey-coated, white-haired old men with broken hearts for a lost cause, it flows unimpeded by the faintest conception of man, and we love it all the more that, like the priestess of Isis, it is calm-browed even in indignity. To its banks at the end of Moss Street, one day there came a man and a maiden. They were both tall and lithe and slender, with the agility of youth and fire. He was the final concentration of the essence of Spanish passion, filtered into an American frame; she a repressed Southern exotic, trying to fit itself into the niches of a modern civilization. Truly a fitting couple to seek the bayou banks. They climbed the levee that stretched a feeble check to waters that seldom rise, and on the other side of the embankment, at the brink of the river, she sat on a log and impatiently pulled off the little cap she wore. The skies were gray, heavy, overcast, with an occasional wind rift in the clouds that only revealed new depths of grayness behind. The tideless waters murmured a faint ripple against the logs and jutting beams of the breakwater, and were answered by the crescendo wail of the dried reeds on the other bank, reeds that rustled and moaned among themselves for the golden days of summer sunshine. He stood up, his dark form a slender silhouette against the sky. She looked upward from her log, and their eyes met with an exquisite shock of recognizing understanding. Dark eyes into dark eyes, Iberian fire into Iberian fire, soul into soul. It was enough. He sat down and took her into his arms, and in the eerie murmur of the storm coming they talked of the future. "And then I hope to go to Italy or France. It is only there, beneath those far southern skies, that I could ever hope to attain to anything that the soul within me says I can. I've wasted so much time in the mere struggle for bread, while the powers of a higher calling have clamored for recognition and expression. I will go some day and redeem myself." She was silent a moment, watching with half-closed lids a dejected-looking hunter on the other bank, and a lean dog who trailed through the reeds behind him with drooping tail. Then she asked, "And I? What will become of me?" "You, Athanasia. There is a great future before you, little woman, and I, my love, can only mar it. Try to forget me and go your way. I'm only the epitome of unhappiness and ill success." But she laughed and would have none of it. "Will you ever forget that day, Athanasia? How the little gamins, Creole throughout, came half shyly near the log, fishing and exchanging furtive whispers and half-concealed glances at the silent couple. Their angling was rewarded only by a little black water moccasin that wriggled and forked its venomous red tongue in an attempt to exercise its death-dealing prerogative. This Athanasia insisted must go back into its native black waters, and paid the price the boys asked that it might enjoy its freedom. The gamins laughed and chattered in their soft patois. The Don smiled tenderly upon Athanasia, and she durst not look at the reeds as she talked, lest their crescendo sadness yield a foreboding. Just then a wee girl appeared, clad in a multi-hued garment, evidently a sister to a small fisherman. Her keen black eyes, set in a dusky face, glanced sharply and suspiciously at the group as she clambered over the wet embankment, and it seemed the drizzling mist grew colder, the sobbing wind more pronounced in its prophetic wail. Athanasia rose suddenly. "Let us go," she said. "The eternal feminine has spoiled it all." The bayou flows as calmly, as darkly, as full of hidden passions as ever. On a night years after, the moon was shining upon it with a silvery tenderness that seemed brighter, more caressingly lingering than anywhere within the old city. Behind there rose the spires and towers, before only the reeds, green now and soft in their rustlings and whisperings for the future. False reeds! They tell themselves of their happiness to be, and it all ends in dry stalks and drizzling skies. The mockingbird in the fragrant orange grove sends out his night song, and blends it with the cricket's chirp, as the blossoms of orange and magnolia mingle their perfume with the earthy smell of a summer rain just blown over. perfect in its stillness, absolute in its beauty, tenderly healing in its suggestion of peace. The night in its clear, lighted, cloudless sweetness enfolds Athanasia as she stands on the levee and gazes down at the old log, now almost hidden in the luxuriant grass. It was the eternal feminine that spoiled our dream that day as it spoiled the afterlife, was it not? But the Bayou St. John did not answer. It merely gathered into its silent bosom another broken-hearted romance and flowed dispassionately on its way. End of section 5. Section 6 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When the Bayou Overflows. When the sun goes down behind the great oaks along the Bayou Teche near Franklin, it throws red needles of light into the dark woods and leaves a great glow on the still bayou. Mame Mouton paused at her gate and cast a contemplative look at the red sky. "It will rain to-morrow, sho. I must get in my things." Mame Mouton's remark must have been addressed to herself or to the lean dog, for no one else was visible. She moved briskly about the yard, taking things from the line, when Louisette's voice called cheerily, "Ah, Mame Mouton, can I help?" Louisette was petite and plump and black-haired. Louisette's eyes danced and her lips were red and tempting. Mame Mouton's face relaxed as the small brown hands relieved hers of their burden. "Sylvis, has he come yet?" asked the red mouth. "Mais non, ma chère," said Mame Mouton sadly. "I can tell for why he no come home soon dese day. Ah, me, I feel like something goin' happen, he's so strange." Even as she spoke, a quick, nervous step was heard crunching up the brick walk. Sylvis paused an instant without the kitchen door, his face turned to the setting sun. He was tall and slim and agile, a true Cajun. "Bonjour, Louisette," he laughed. "Eh, maman! Ah, my son, you are very late." Sylvis frowned, but said nothing. It was a silent supper that followed. Louisette was sad. Mame Mouton sighed now and then. Sylvis was constrained. "Maman," he said at length, "I'm going away." Mame Mouton dropped her fork and stared at him with unseeing eyes. Then, as she comprehended his remark, she put her hand out to him with a pitiful gesture. "Sylvis!" cried Louisette, springing to her feet. "Maman, don't," he said weakly. Then, gathering strength from the silence, he burst forth. "Yes, I'm going away to work. I'm tired of dis. Just dig work in de field. Nothin' to see but de cloud, de tree, de bayou. I don't like New Orleans. It too near here. Dere no mo' money dere. I go up for Mardi Gras, and de same people, de same strit. I'm going to Chicago." "Sylvis!" screamed both women at once. Chicago, that vast, far-off city that seemed in another world. Chicago, a name to conjure with for wickedness. "Why, yes," continued Sylvis. "Lots of boys I know dere. Henri and Joseph Lascaux and Arthur, dey write me what money dey make in cigar. I can make a living, too. I can make fine cigar. See how I do in New Orleans in de winter." "Oh, Sylvis!" wailed Louisette, "then you'll forget me." "Non, non, ma chère," he answered tenderly. "I will come back when the bayou overflows again, and maman and Louisette will have fine present." Mame Mouton had bowed her head on her hands and was rocking to and fro in an agony of dry-eyed misery. Sylvis went to her side and knelt. "Maman," he said softly, "maman, you must not cry. All de boys go way, and I will come back reach, and you won't have for to work no mo'." But Mame Mouton was inconsolable. It was even as Sylvis had said. In the summer-time the boys of the Bayou Teche would work in the field or in the town of Franklin, hack driving and doing odd jobs. When winter came there was a general exodus to New Orleans, 100 miles away, where work was to be had as cigar makers. There is money, plenty of it, in cigar-making, if one can get in the right place. Of late, however, there had been a general slackness of the trade. Last winter, oftentimes, Silvis had walked the streets out of work. Many were the Creole boys who had gone to Chicago to earn a living, for the cigar-making trade flourishes there wonderfully. Friends of Silvis had gone and written home glowing accounts of the money to be had almost for the asking. When one's blood leaps for new scenes, new adventures, and one needs money, what is the use of fritting away time alternately between the Bayou Teche and New Orleans? Silvis had brooded all summer, and now that September had come, he was determined to go. Louisette, the orphan, the girl lover, whom everyone in Franklin knew would some day be Ma'am Mouton's daughter-in-law, wept and pleaded in vain. Silvis kissed her quivering lips. "Ma chère," he would say, "tink I will bring you one fine diamond ring next spring when the bayou overflows again." Louisette would fain be content with this promise. As for Ma'am Mouton, she seemed to have grown ages older. Her Silvis was going from her. Silvis, whose trips to New Orleans had been a yearly source of heartbreak, was going far away for months to that mistily wicked city 1,000 miles away. October came, and Silvis had gone. Ma'am Mouton had kept up bravely until the last, when with one final cry she extended her arms to the pitiless train bearing him northward. Then she and Louisette went home drearily, the one leaning upon the other. Ah, that was a great day when the first letter came from Chicago. Louisette came running in breathlessly from the post office, and together they read it again and again. Chicago was such a wonderful city, said Silvis. Why, it was always like New Orleans. At Mardi Gras with the people. He had seen Joseph Lascaux, and he had a place to work promised him. He was well, but he wanted oh so much to see Maman and Louisette. But then he could wait. Was ever such a wonderful letter? Louisette sat for an hour afterwards building gorgeous air castles, while Ma'am Mouton fingered the paper and murmured prayers to the Virgin for Silvis. When the Bayou overflowed again, that would be in April. Then Louisette caught herself looking critically at her slender brown fingers and blushed furiously, though Ma'am Mouton could not see her in the gathering twilight. Next week there was another letter, even more wonderful than the first. Silvis had found work. He was making cigars and was earning $2 a day. Such wages! Ma'am Mouton and Louisette began to plan pretty things for the brown cottage on the Teche. That was a pleasant winter after all. True, there was no Silvis, but then he was always in New Orleans for a few months anyway. There were his letters, full of wondrous tales of the great queer city where cars went by ropes underground, and where there was no Mardi Gras, and the people did not mind Lent. Now and then there would be a present, a keepsake for Louisette, and some money for Maman. They would plan improvements for the cottage, and Louisette began to do sewing and dainty crochet, which she would hide with a blush if anyone hinted at a trousseau. It was March now, and springtime. The bayou began to sweep down between its banks less sluggishly than before. It was rising, and soon would spread it over its tiny levees. The doors could be left open now, though the trees were not yet green. But then down here the trees do not swell and bud slowly and tease you for weeks with promises of greenness. Dear no, they simply look mysterious, and their twigs shake against each other and tell secrets of the leaves that will soon be born. Then one morning you awake, and lo, it is a green world. The boughs have suddenly clothed themselves all in a wondrous garment, and you feel the blood run right in your veins out of pure sympathy. One day in March it was warm and sweet. Underfoot were violets and wee white star-flowers peering through the baby grass. The sky was blue, with flecks of white clouds reflecting themselves in the brown bayou. Louisette tripped up the red brick walk with the Chicago letter in her hand, and paused a minute at the door to look upon the leaping waters, her eyes dancing. "I know the bayou must be ready to overflow," went the letter in the carefully phrased French that the brothers taught at the parochial school, "and I am glad, for I want to see the dear Maman and my Louisette. I am not so well, and Monsieur le Docteur says it is well for me to go to the South again." Monsieur le Docteur! Silvis not well! The thought struck a chill to the hearts of Ma'am Mouton and Louisette, but not for long. Of course Silvis was not well. He needed some of Maman's tisanes. Then he was homesick. It was to be expected. At last the great day came. Sylvis would be home. The brown waters of the bayou had spread until they were seemingly trying to rival the Mississippi in width. The little house was scrubbed and cleaned until it shone again. Louisette had looked at her dainty little dress over and over to be sure that there was not a flaw to be found wherein Sylvis could compare her unfavorably to the stylish Chicago girls. The train rumbled in on the platform, and two pair of eyes opened wide for the first glimpse of Sylvis. The porter, all officiousness and brass buttons, bustled up to Ma'am Mouton. "This is Mrs. Mouton?" he inquired deferentially. Ma'am Mouton nodded, and her heart sinking. "Where is Sylvis?" "He is here, madame." There appeared Joseph Lascaux, then some men bearing something. Louisette put her hands up to her eyes to hide the sight, but Ma'am Mouton was rigid. It was too cold for him, Joseph was saying to almost deaf ears, and he took the consumption. He thought he could get well when he come home. He talk all the way down about the bayou and about you and Louisette. Just 3 hours ago he had a bad hemorrhage, and he died from weakness. Just 3 hours ago. He said he wanted to get home and give Louisette her diamond ring when the bayou overflowed. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Baptiste. He might have had another name. We never knew. Someone had christened him Mr. Baptiste long ago in the dim past, and it sufficed. No one had ever been known who had the temerity to ask him for another cognomen, for though he was a mild-mannered little man, he had an uncomfortable way of shutting up oysterwise and looking disagreeable when approached concerning his personal history. He was small. Most Creole men are small when they are old. It is strange, but a fact. It must be that age withers them sooner and more effectually than those of unlatinized extraction. Mr. Baptiste was, furthermore, very much wrinkled and lame. Like the Son of Man, he had nowhere to lay his head, save when some kindly family made room for him in a garret or a barn. He subsisted by doing odd jobs, whitewashing, cleaning yards, doing errands, and the like. The little old man was a frequenter of the levee. Never a day passed that his quaint little figure was not seen, moving up and down about the ships. Chiefly did he haunt the Texas and Pacific warehouses and the landing place of the Morgan Line steamships. This seemed like madness, for these spots are almost the busiest on the levee, and the rough seamen and longshoremen have least time to be bothered with small, weak folks. Still there was method in the madness of Mr. Baptiste. The Morgan steamships, as everyone knows, ply between New Orleans and Central and South American ports, doing the major part of the fruit trade. And many were the baskets of forgotten fruit that Mr. Baptiste took away with him unmolested. Sometimes, you know, bananas and mangoes and oranges and citrons will half spoil, particularly if it has been a bad voyage over the stormy Gulf, and the officers of the ships will give away stacks of fruit too good to go into the river, too bad to sell to the fruit dealers. You could see Mr. Baptiste trudging up the street with his quaint one-sided walk, bearing his dilapidated basket on one shoulder, a nondescript head cover pulled over his eyes, whistling cheerily. Then he would slip in at the back door of one of his clients with a brisk, "Ah, bonjour, madame. Now here ye's just a little bit fruit, some bananas. Perhaps madame will cook some for Mr. Baptiste." And madame, who understood and knew his ways, would fry him some of the bananas and set it before him, a tempting dish with a bit of madame's bread and meat and coffee thrown in for lagniappe. And Mr. Baptiste would depart, filled and contented, leaving the load of fruit behind as madame's pay. Thus did he eat, and his clients were many, and never too tired or too cross to cook his meals and get their pay in baskets of fruit. One day he slipped in at Madame Garcia's kitchen door with such a woebegone air, and slid a small sack of nearly ripe plantains on the table with such a misery-laden sigh, that Madame, who was fat and excitable, threw up both hands and cried out, "Mon Dieu, Master Baptiste, for why you look like dat? What is de matter?" For answer, Mr. Baptiste shook his head gloomily and sighed again. Madame Garcia moved heavily about the kitchen, putting the plantains in a cool spot, and punctuating her footsteps with sundry "Mon Dieu" and "Misereres." "Dose cotton!" ejaculated Mr. Baptiste at last. "Ah, mon Dieu!" groaned Madame Garcia, rolling her eyes heavenwards. "Hit will drive de fruit away," he continued. "Miserere," said Madame Garcia. "Hit will." "We out," said Madame Garcia. She had carefully inspected the plantains, and seeing that they were good and wholesome, was inclined to agree with anything Mr. Baptiste said. He grew excited. "Yaas, dose cotton yard mans, dose longshowmans, dey go out on one strike. Dey throw down dey tool and say dey work no mo' wid niggers. Les vaisseaux dey lay in de river, no work, no cargo, yaas. Den de fruit ship dey can make land demands. Dey threaten and say tings. Dey make big fight, yaas. There no mo' work on de levee lak dat. Everybody just walk round and say cuss word, yaas." "Oh, mon Dieu," groaned Madame Garcia, rocking her guinea blue-clad self to and fro. Mr. Baptiste picked up his nondescript head-cover and walked out through the brick-reddened alley, talking excitedly to himself. Madame Garcia called after him to know if he did not want his luncheon, but he shook his head and passed on. Down on the levee it was even as Mr. Baptiste had said. The longshoremen, the cotton yardmen, and the stevedores had gone out on a strike. The levee lay hot and unsheltered under the glare of a noonday sun. The turgid Mississippi scarce seemed to flow, but gave forth a brazen gleam from its yellow bosom. Great vessels lay against the wharf, silent and unpopulated. Excited groups of men clustered here and there among bales of uncompressed cotton lying about in disorderly profusion. Cargoes of molasses and sugar gave out a sticky, sweet smell, and now and then the fierce rays of the sun would kindle tiny blazes in the cotton and splinter mixed dust underfoot. Mr. Baptiste wandered in and out among the groups of men, exchanging a friendly salutation here and there. He looked a picture of woebegone misery. "Hullo, Mr. Baptiste!" cried a big, brawny Irishman. "Sure, and you look as if you was about to be hanged." "Ah, mon Dieu," said Mr. Baptiste, "dose fruit ship be ruined for dese strike." "Damn the fruit!" cheerily replied the Irishman, artistically disposing of a mouthful of tobacco juice. "It ain't the fruit we care about, it's the cotton." "Hear, hear!" cried a dozen lusty comrades. Mr. Baptiste shook his head and moved sorrowfully away. "Hey, by Howley St. Patrick, here's that little fruit-eater!" called the centre of another group of strikers perched on cotton bales. "Hullo, where—" began a second, but the leader suddenly held up his hand for silence, and the men listened eagerly. It might not have been a sound, for the levee lay quiet, and the mules on the cotton drays dozed languidly, their ears pitched at varying acute angles, but the practised ears of the men heard a familiar sound stealing up over the heated stillness. "Oh, ho, ho, humph, 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 oh, ho, ho, oh, oh, humph!" Then the faint rattle of chains and the steady thump of a machine pounding. If ever you go on the levee you'll know that sound, the rhythmic song of the stevedores heaving cotton bales, and the steady thump, thump of the machine compressing them within the hold of the ship. Finnegan, the leader, who had held up his hand for silence, uttered an oath. "Scabs, men, come on." There was no need for a further invitation. The men rose in sullen wrath and went down the levee, the crowd gathering in numbers as it passed along. Mr. Baptiste followed in its wake, now and then sighing a mournful protest which was lost in the roar of the men. "Scabs," Finnegan had said, and the word was passed along until it seemed that the half of the second district knew and had risen to investigate. "Oh, ho, ho, humph, 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 oh, oh, ho, oh, 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 humph." The rhythmic chorus sounded nearer, and the cause manifested itself when the curve of the levee above the French market was passed. There rose a White Star steamer, insolently settling itself to the water as each consignment of cotton bales was compressed into her hold. "Niggers!" roared Finnegan wrathily. "Niggers, niggers, kill 'em, scabs!" chorused the crowd. with muscles standing out like cables through their blue cotton shirts and sweat rolling from glossy black skins. The Negro stevedores were at work, steadily laboring at the cotton, with the rhythmic song swinging its cadence in the hot air. The roar of the crowd caused the men to look up with momentary apprehension, but at the overseer's reassuring word they bent back to work. Finnegan was a Titan. With livid face and bursting veins, he ran into the street facing the French market and uprooted a huge block of paving stone. Staggering under its weight, he rushed back to the ship and with one mighty effort hurled it into the hold. The delicate poles of the costly machine tottered in the air, then fell forward with a crash as the whole iron framework in the hold collapsed. "Damn ye!" shouted Finnegan. "Now ye's can pack your cotton." The crowd's cheers at this changed to howls, as the negroes, infuriated at their loss, for those costly machines belonged to the laborers and not to the ship owners, turned upon the mob and began to throw brickbats, pieces of iron, chunks of wood, anything that came to hand. It was pandemonium turned loose over a turgid stream, with a malarial sun to heat the passions to fever point. Mr. Baptiste had taken refuge behind a bread stall on the outside of the market. He had taken off his cap and was weakly cheering the negroes on. "Bravo!" cheered Mr. Baptiste. "Will yees look at that damn fruit-eatin' Frenchman?" howled McMahon. "Cheerin' the niggers, are you?" and he let fly a brickbat in the direction of the bread stall. "Oh, mon Dieu!" wailed the bread woman. Mr. Baptiste lay very still with a great ugly gash in his wrinkled brown temple. Fishmen and vegetable marchands gathered around him in a quick, sympathetic mass. Their individual, the concrete bit of helpless humanity, had more interest for them than the vast, vague, fighting mob beyond. The noon hour pealed from the brazen throats of many bells, and the numerous hoarse whistles of the steamboats called the unheeded luncheon time to the levee workers. The war waged furiously, and groans of the wounded mingled with curses and roars from the combatants. "Killed instantly," said the surgeon, carefully lifting Mr. Baptiste into the ambulance. Tramp, 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 sounded the militia, steadily marching down Decatur Street. "Whist! Do yez hear?" shouted Finnegan, and the conflict had ceased ere the yellow river could reflect the sun from the polished bayonets. "You remember, of course, how long the strike lasted, and how many battles were fought and lives lost before the final adjustment of affairs. It was a fearsome war, and many forgot afterwards whose was the first life lost in the struggle. Poor little Mr. Baptiste, whose body lay at the morgue unclaimed for days before it was finally dropped unnamed into Potter's Field." End of section 7. Section 8 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Carnival Jangle. There is a merry jangle of bells in the air, an all-pervading sense of jesters' noise, and the flaunting vividness of royal colors. The streets swarm with humanity in all shapes, manners, forms, laughing, pushing, jostling, crowding, a mass of men and women and children, as varied and assorted in their several individual peculiarities as ever a crowd that gathered in one locality since the days of Babel. It is Carnival in New Orleans, a brilliant Tuesday in February, when the very air gives forth an ozone intensely exhilarating, making one long to cut capers. The buildings are a blazing mass of royal purple and golden yellow, national flags, bunting and decorations that laugh in the glint of the Midas sun. The streets are a crush of jesters and maskers, Jim Crows and clowns, ballet girls and Mephistos, Indians and monkeys, of wild and sudden flashes of music, of glittering pageants and comic ones, of befeathered and belled horses, a dream of color and melody and fantasy gone wild, in an effervescent bubble of beauty that shifts and changes and passes kaleidoscope-like before the bewildered eye. A bevy of bright-eyed girls and boys of that uncertain age that hovers between childhood and maturity were moving down Canal Street when there was a sudden jostle with another crowd meeting them. For a minute there was a deafening clamor of shouts and laughter, cracking of the whips which all maskers carry, a jingle and clatter of carnival bells, and the masked and unmasked extricated themselves and moved from each other's paths. But in the confusion a tall prince of darkness had whispered to one of the girls in the unmasked crowd, "You'd better come with us, Flo. You're wasting time in that tame gang. Slip off, they'll never miss you. We'll get you a rig and show you what life is." And so it happened, when a half hour passed and the bright-eyed bevy missed Flo and couldn't find her, wisely giving up the search at last, she, the quietest and most bashful of the lot, was being initiated into the mysteries of what life is. Down Bourbon Street and on Toulouse and St. Peter Streets there are quaint little old world places where one may be disguised effectually for a tiny consideration. Thither, guided by the shapely Mephisto, and guarded by the team of jockeys and ballet girls, tripped Flo. Into one of the lowest ceiled, dingiest, and most ancient-looking of these shops they stepped. "A disguise for the demoiselle," announced Mephisto to the woman who met them. She was small and wizened and old, with yellow flabby jaws, a neck like the throat of an alligator, and straight white hair that stood from her head uncannily stiff. "But the demoiselle wishes to appear a boy, un petit garçon," she inquired, gazing eagerly at Flo's long, slender frame. Her voice was old and thin, like the high quavering of an imperfect tuning fork, and her eyes were sharp as talons in their grasping glance. "Mademoiselle does not wish such a costume," gruffly responded Mephisto. "Ma foi, there is no other," said the ancient, shrugging her shoulders. "But one is left now. Mademoiselle would make a fine troubadour." "Flo," said Mephisto, "it's a dare-devil scheme. Try it. No one will ever know it but us, and we'll die before we tell. Besides, we must. It's late, and you couldn't find your crowd." And that was why you might have seen a Mephisto in a slender troubadour of lovely form, with mandolin flung across his shoulder, followed by a bevy of jockeys and ballet girls, laughing and singing as they swept down Rampart Street. When the flash and glare and brilliancy of Canal Street have palled upon the tired eye, when it is yet too soon to go home to such a prosaic thing as dinner, and one still wishes for novelty, then it is wise to go into the lower districts. There is fantasy and fancy and grotesqueness run wild in the costuming and the behaviour of the maskers. Such dances and whoops and leaps as these hideous Indians and devils do indulge in, such wild curvettings and long walks in the open squares where whole groups do congregate, it is wonderfully amusing. Then, too, there is a ball in every available hall, a delirious ball where one may dance all day for 10 cents, dance and grow mad for joy, and never know who were your companions, and be yourself unknown. And in the exhilaration of the day one walks miles and miles, and dances and skips, and the fatigue is never felt. In Washington Square, way down where Royal Street empties its stream of children, great and small, into the broad channel of Elysian Fields Avenue, there was a perfect Indian powwow. With a little imagination one might have willed away the vision of the surrounding houses, and fancied one's self again in the forest, where the natives were holding a sacred riot. The square was filled with spectators, masked and unmasked. It was amusing to watch these mimic red men. They seemed so fierce and earnest. Suddenly one chief touched another on the elbow. "See that Mephisto and troubadour over there?" he whispered huskily. "Yes, who are they?" "I don't know the devil," responded the other quietly, "but I'd know that other form anywhere. It's Léon. See, I know those white hands like a woman's, and that restless head. Ha! But there may be a mistake. No, I'd know that one anywhere. I feel it is he. I'll pay him now. Ah, sweetheart, you've waited long, but you shall feast now." He was caressing something long and lithe and glittering beneath his blanket. In a masked dance it is easy to give a death blow between the shoulders. Two crowds meet and laugh, and shout and mingle almost inextricably, and if a shriek of pain should rise, it is not noticed in the din. And when they part, if one should stagger and fall bleeding to the ground, can any one tell who has given the blow? There is nothing but an unknown stiletto on the ground. The crowd was dispersed, and masks tell no tales anyway. There is murder, but by whom? For what? Qui sabe? And that is how it happened on Carnival night. In the last mad moments of Rex's reign, a broken-hearted mother sat gazing, wide-eyed and mute, at a horrible something that lay across the bed. Outside, the long, sweet march music of many bands floated in as if in mockery, and the flash of rockets and Bengal lights illumined the dead white face of the girl troubadour. End of section 8. Section 9 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Little Miss Sophie. When Miss Sophie knew consciousness again, the long, faint, swelling notes of the organ were dying away in distant echoes through the great arches of the silent church, and she was alone, crouching in a little forsaken black heap at the altar of the Virgin. The twinkling tapers shone pityingly upon her. The beneficent smile of the white-robed Madonna seemed to whisper comfort. A long gust of chill air swept up the aisles, and Miss Sophie shivered not from cold but from nervousness. But darkness was falling, and soon the lights would be lowered, and the great massive doors would be closed. So gathering her thin little cape about her frail shoulders, Miss Sophie hurried out and along the brilliant, noisy streets home. It was a wretched, lonely little room, where the cracks let the boisterous wind whistle through, and the smoky, grimy walls looked cheerless and unhome-like. A miserable little room in a miserable little cottage in one of the squalid streets of the 3rd district that nature and the city fathers seemed to have forgotten. As bare and comfortless as the room was Miss Sophie's life, she rented these 4 walls from an unkempt little Creole woman, whose progeny seemed like the promised offspring of Abraham. She scarcely kept the flickering life in her pale little body by the unceasing toil of a pair of bony hands, stitching, ceaselessly, wearyingly, on the bands and pockets of trousers. It was her bread, this monotonous, unending work, and though whole days and nights constant labor brought but the most meagre recompense, it was her only hope of life. She sat before the little charcoal brazier and warmed her transparent, needle-pricked fingers, thinking meanwhile of the strange events of the day. She had been uptown to carry the great black bundle of coarse pants and vests to the factory, and to receive her small pittance, and on the way home stopped in at the Jesuit church to say her little prayer at the altar of the calm white Virgin. There had been a wondrous burst of music from the great organ as she knelt there, an overpowering perfume of many flowers, the glittering dazzle of many lights, and the dainty frou-frou made by the silken skirts of wedding guests. So Miss Sophie stayed to the wedding, for what feminine heart, be it ever so old and seared, does not delight in one, and why should not a poor little Creole old maid be interested too? Then the wedding party had filed in solemnly to the rolling, swelling tones of the organ. Important-looking groomsmen, dainty, fluffy, white-robed maids, stately, satin-robed, illusion-veiled bride, and happy groom. She leaned forward to catch a better glimpse of their faces. Ah! Those near the Virgin's altar, who heard a faint sigh and rustle on the steps, glanced curiously as they saw a slight, black-robed figure clutch the railing and lean her head against it. Miss Sophie had fainted. I must have been hungry, she mused over the charcoal fire in her little room. I must have been hungry, and she smiled a wan smile and busied herself getting her evening meal of coffee and bread and ham. If one were given to pity, the first thought that would rush to one's lips at sight of Miss Sophie would have been, poor little woman. She had come among the bareness and sordidness of this neighborhood 5 years ago, robed in crape, and crying with great sobs that seemed to shake the vitality out of her. Perfectly silent, too, she was about her former life. But for all that, Michel the Courtis grocer at the corner, and Madame Laurent, who kept the rabbi shop opposite, had fixed it all up between them of her sad history and past glories. Not that they knew, But then Michel must invent something when the neighbors came to him as their fountain-head of wisdom. One morning little Miss Sophie opened wide her dingy windows to catch the early freshness of the autumn wind as it whistled through the yellow-leafed trees. It was one of those calm, blue-misted, balmy November days that New Orleans can have when all the rest of the country is fur-wrapped. Miss Sophie pulled her machine to the window, where the sweet, damp wind could whisk among her black locks. Whir, whir, went the machine, ticking fast and lightly over the belts of the rough jeans pants. Whir, whir, yes, and Miss Sophie was actually humming a tune. She felt strangely light to-day. "Ma foi," muttered Michel, strolling across the street to where Madame Laurent sat sewing behind the counter in blue and brown checked aprons. "But the little mamselle sings. Perhaps she recollects." "Perhaps," muttered the Rabbie woman. But little Miss Sophie felt restless. A strange impulse seemed drawing her uptown, and the machine seemed to run slow, slow, before it would stitch all of the endless number of jeans belts. Her fingers trembled with nervous haste as she pinned up the unwieldy black bundle of finished work, and her feet fairly tripped over each other in their eagerness to get to Claiborne Street, where she could board the uptown car. There was a feverish desire to go somewhere, a sense of elation, a foolish happiness that brought a faint echo of color into her pinched cheeks. She wondered why. No one noticed her in the car. Passengers on the Claiborne line are too much accustomed to frail little black-robed women with big black bundles. It is one of the city's most pitiful sights. She leaned her head out of the window to catch a glimpse of the oleanders on Bayou Road, when her attention was caught by a conversation in the car. "Yes, it's too bad for Neil, and lately married, too," said the elder man. "I can't see what he is to do." Neil. She pricked up her ears. That was the name of the groom in the Jesuit church. "How did it happen?" languidly inquired the younger. He was a stranger, evidently, a stranger with a high regard for the faultlessness of male attire. "Well, the firm failed first. He didn't mind that much. He was so sure of his uncle's inheritance repairing his lost fortunes. But suddenly this difficulty of identification springs up, and he is literally on the verge of ruin. Won't some of you fellows who've known him all your lives do to identify him?" "Gracious, man, we've tried, but the absurd old will expressly stipulates that he shall be known only by a certain quaint Roman ring, and unless he has it, no identification, no fortune. He has given the ring away, and that settles it." "Well, you're all chumps. Why doesn't he get the ring from the owner?" "Easily said, but it seems that Neil had some little Creole love affair some years ago, and gave this ring to his dusky-eyed fiancée. You know how Neil is with his love affairs. Went off and forgot the girl in a month. It seems, however, she took it to heart, so much so that he's ashamed to try to find her or the ring." Miss Sophie heard no more as she gazed out into the dusty grass. There were tears in her eyes, hot blinding ones that wouldn't drop for pride, but stayed and scalded. She knew the story with all its embellishment of heartaches. She knew the ring, too. She remembered the day she had kissed and wept and fondled it until it seemed her heart must burst under its load of grief before she took it to the pawnbroker's, that another might be eased before the end came. That other, her father. The little Creole love affair of Neil's had not always been poor and old and jaded looking, but reverses must come. Even Neil knew that, so the ring was at the Mont de Piété. Still, he must have it. It was his. It would save him from disgrace and suffering, and from bringing the white-gowned bride into sorrow. He must have it, but how? There it was still at the pawnbroker's. No one would have such an odd jewel, and the ticket was home in the bureau drawer. Well, he must have it. She might starve in the attempt. Such a thing as going to him and telling him that he might redeem it was an impossibility. That good, straight-backed, stiff-necked Creole blood would have risen in all its strength and choked her. No, as a present, had the quaint Roman circlet been placed upon her finger, as a present should it be returned. The bumping car rode slowly, and the hot thoughts beat heavily in her poor little head. He must have the ring, but how? The ring, the Roman ring, the white-robed bride starving. She was going mad. Ah, yes, the church. There it was, right in the busiest, most bustling part of the town, its fresco and bronze and iron quaintly suggestive of medieval times. Within all was cool and dim and restful, with the faintest whiff of lingering incense rising and pervading the grey arches. Yes, the Virgin would know and have pity, the sweet white-robed Virgin at the pretty flower-decked altar, or the one away up in the niche, far above the golden dome, where the host was. Tititi, the busybody of the house, noticed that Miss Sophie's bundle was larger than usual that afternoon. Ah, poor woman, sighed Titici's mother, she would be rich for Christmas. The bundle grew larger each day, and Miss Sophie grew smaller. The damp, cold rain and mist closed the white-curtained window, but always there behind the sewing-machine drooped and bobbed the little black-robed figure. Whir, whir, went the wheels, and the coarse jeans pants piled in great heaps at her side. The Claiborne Street car saw her oftener than before, and the sweet white Virgin in the flowered niche above the gold-domed altar smiled at the little supplicant almost every day. Ma foi, said the slatternly landlady to Madame Laurent and Michel one day, I no see how she live. Eat? Nothing almost, and last night when it was so cold and foggy, I have to make him build fire. She most freeze. Whereupon the rumour spread that Miss Sophie was starving herself to death to get some luckless relative out of jail for Christmas, a rumour which enveloped her scraggy little figure with a kind of halo to the neighbours when she appeared on the streets. November had merged into December, and the little pile of coins was yet far from the sum needed. Dear God, how the money did have to go! The rent and the groceries and the coal, though to be sure she used a precious bit of that. Would all the work and saving and skimping do good? Maybe yes, maybe by Christmas. Christmas Eve on Royal Street is no place for a weakling, for the shouts and carousals of the roisterers will strike fear into the bravest ones. Yet amid the cries and yells, the deafening blow of horns and tin whistles, and the really dangerous fusillade of fireworks, a little figure hurried along, one hand clutching tightly the battered hat that the rude merrymakers had torn off, the other grasping under the thin black cape a worn little pocket-book. Into the Mont de Piete she ran, breathless, eager. The ticket, here, worn, crumpled. The ring, it was not gone. No, thank heaven, it was a joy well worth her toil, she thought, to have it again. Had Titici not been shooting crackers on the banquette instead of peering into the crack as was his wont, his big round black eyes would have grown saucer-wide to see little Miss Sophie kiss and fondle a ring, an ugly, clumsy band of gold. Ah, dear ring, she murmured, once you were his, and you shall be his again. You shall be on his finger, and perhaps touch his heart. Dear ring, ma chère petite de ma cour, chérie de ma cour, je t'aime, oui, oui, you are his, you were mine once too. Tonight, just one night, I'll keep you, then tomorrow you shall go where you can save him. The loud whistles and horns of the little ones rose on the balmy air next morning. No one would doubt it was Christmas Day, even if doors and windows were open wide to let in cool air. Why, there was Christmas even in the very look of the mules on the pokey cars. There was Christmas noise in the streets, and Christmas toys, and Christmas odors, savory ones that made the nose wrinkle approvingly, issuing from the kitchen. Michel and Madame Laurent smiled greetings across the street at each other, and the salutation from a passer-by recalled the many-progenied landlady to herself. Miss Sophie, well, poor soul, not very much Christmas for her. May I'll just call him in for to spend the day with me. It'll cheer her a bit. It was so clean and orderly within the poor little room, not a speck of dust or a litter of any kind on the quaint little old-time high bureau, unless you might except a sheet of paper lying loose with something written on it. Tititi had evidently inherited his prying propensities, for the landlady turned it over and read: "Louis, here is the ring. I return it to you. I heard you needed it. I hope it comes not too late. Sophie." "The ring! Where?" muttered the landlady. There it was, clasped between her fingers on her bosom, a bosom white and cold, under a cold, happy face. Christmas had indeed dawned for Miss Sophie. End of section 9. Section 10 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sister Josepha. Sister Josepha told her beads mechanically, her fingers numb with the accustomed exercise. The little organ creaked a dismal "O salutaris," and she still knelt on the floor, her white bonneted head nodding suspiciously. The Mother Superior gave a sharp glance at the tired figure, then as a sudden lurch forward brought the little sister back to consciousness, Mother's eyes relaxed into a genuine smile. The bell tolled the end of vespers, and the sombre-robed nuns filed out of the chapel to go about their evening duties. Little Sister Josepha's work was to attend to the household lamps, but there must have been as much oil spilled upon the table to-night as was put in the vessels. The small brown hands trembled so that most of the wicks were trimmed with points at one corner, which caused them to smoke that night. "Oh, cher Seigneur," she sighed, giving an impatient polish to a refractory chimney, "it is wicked and sinful, I know, but I am so tired. I can't be happy and sing any more. It doesn't seem right for le bon Dieu to have me all cooped up here with nothing to see but stray visitors, and always the same old work, teaching those mean little girls to sew, and washing and filling the same old lamps. Pah!" And she polished the chimney with a sudden vigorous jerk which threatened destruction. They were rebellious prayers that the red mouth murmured that night, and a restless figure that tossed on the hard dormitory bed. Sister Dominica called from her couch to know if Sister Josepha were ill. "No," was the somewhat short response. Then her muttered, "Why can't they let me alone for a minute? That pale-eyed Sister Dominica never sleeps. That's why she is so ugly." About 15 years before this night, someone had brought to the orphan asylum connected with this convent du Sacré-Cœur a round, dimpled bit of 3-year-old humanity, who regarded the world from a pair of gravely twinkling black eyes, and only took a chubby thumb out of a rosy mouth long enough to answer in monosyllabic French. It was a child without an identity. There was but one name that any one seemed to know, and that, too, was vague: Camille. She grew up with the rest of the waifs, scraps of French and American civilization thrown together to develop a seemingly inconsistent miniature world. Mademoiselle Camille was a queen among them, a pretty little tyrant who ruled the children and dominated the more timid sisters in charge. One day an awakening came when she was 15 and almost fully ripened into a glorious tropical beauty of the type that matures early. Some visitors to the convent were fascinated by her and asked the Mother Superior to give the girl into their keeping. Camille fled like a frightened fawn into the yard, and was only unearthed with some difficulty from behind a group of palms. Sulky and pouting, she was led into the parlor, picking at her blue pinafore like a spoiled infant. "The lady and gentleman wish you to go home with them, Camille," said the Mother Superior in the language of the convent. Her voice was kind and gentle, apparently, but the child, accustomed to its various inflections, detected a steely ring behind its softness, like the proverbial iron hand in the velvet glove. "You must understand, madame," continued mother, in stilted English, "that we never force children from us. We are ever glad to place them in comfortable, how you say that, quarters, maison, homes, bien, but we will not make them go if they do not wish." Camille stole a glance at her would-be guardians, and decided instantly, impulsively, finally. The woman suited her, but the man! It was doubtless intuition of the quick, vivacious sort which belonged to her blood that served her. Untutored in worldly knowledge, she could not divine the meaning of the pronounced leers and admiration of her physical charms which gleamed in the man's face, but she knew it made her feel creepy, and stoutly refused to go. Next day Camille was summoned from a task to the Mother Superior's parlor. The other girls gazed with envy upon her as she dashed down the courtyard with impetuous movement. Camille, they decided crossly, received too much notice. It was Camille this, Camille that. She was pretty. It was to be expected. Even Father Ray lingered longer in his blessing when his hands pressed her silky black hair. As she entered the parlor a strange chill swept over the girl. The room was not an unaccustomed one, for she had swept it many times, but to-day the stiff black chairs, the dismal crucifixes, the gleaming whiteness of the walls, even the cheap lithograph of the Madonna, which Camille had always regarded as a perfect specimen of art, seemed cold and mean. "Camille, ma chère," said mother, "I am extremely displeased with you. Why did you not wish to go with Monsieur and Madame la Fay yesterday?" The girl uncrossed her hands from her bosom and spread them out in a deprecating gesture. "Mais, ma mère, I was afraid." Mother's face grew stern. "No foolishness now!" she exclaimed. "It is not foolishness, ma mère. I could not help it, but that man looked at me so funny. I felt all cold chills down my back. Oh, dear mother, I love the convent and the sisters so. I just want to stay and be a sister, too. May I?" And thus it was that Camille took the white veil at 16 years. Now that the period of novitiate was over, it was just beginning to dawn upon her that she had made a mistake. "Maybe it would have been better had I gone with the funny-looking lady and gentleman," she mused bitterly one night. "Oh, seigneur, I'm so tired and impatient. It's so dull here, and, dear God, I'm so young." There was no help for it. One must arise in the morning and help in the refectory with the stupid Sister Francesca, and go about one's duties with a prayerful mien, and not even let a sigh escape when one's head ached with the eternal telling of beads. A great fete day was coming, and an atmosphere of preparation and mild excitement pervaded the brown walls of the convent like a delicate aroma. The old cathedral around the corner had stood 100 years, and all the city was rising to do honor to its age and time-softened beauty. There would be a service, oh, but such a one, with 2 cardinals and archbishops and bishops and all the accompanying glitter of soldiers and orchestras. The little sisters of the Convent du Sacré-Cœur clasped their hands in anticipation of the holy joy. Sister Josepha curled her lip. She was so tired of churchly pleasures. The day came, a golden blue spring day, when the air hung heavy with the scent of roses and magnolias, and the sunbeams fairly laughed as they kissed the houses. The old cathedral stood gray and solemn, and the flowers in Jackson Square smiled cheery birthday greetings across the way. The crowd around the door surged and pressed and pushed in its eagerness to get within. Ribbons stretched across the banquette were of no avail to repress it, and important ushers with cardinal colors could do little more. The Sacred Heart sisters filed slowly in at the side door, creating a momentary flutter as they paced reverently to their seats, guarding the blue bonneted orphans. Sister Josepha, determined to see as much of the world as she could, kept her big black eyes opened wide as the church rapidly filled with the fashionably dressed, perfumed, rustling, and self-conscious throng. Her heart beat quickly. The rebellious thoughts that will arise in the most philosophical of us surged in her small, heavily gowned bosom. For her were the gray things, the neutral tinted skies, the ugly garb, the coarse meats; for them the rainbow, the ethereal airiness of earthly joys, the bonbons and glaces of the world. Sister Josefa did not know that the rainbow is elusive, and its colors but the illumination of tears. She had never been told that earthly ethereality is necessarily ephemeral, nor the bonbons and glaces of the world, as whether of the palate or of the soul, nauseate and pall upon the taste. Dear God, forgive her, for she bent with contrite tears over her worn rosary, and glanced no more at the worldly glitter of femininity. The sunbeams streamed through the high windows in purple and crimson lights upon a veritable fugue of colour. Within the seats, crush upon crush of spring millinery. Within the aisles, erect lines of gold-braided, gold-buttoned military. Upon the altar, broad sweeps of golden robes, great dashes of crimson skirts, mitres, and gleaming crosses, the soft neutral hue of rich lace vestments, the tender heads of sheltered and picturesque attire, the proud golden magnificence of the domed altar with its waiting mass of lilies and wide-eyed roses, and the long candles that sparkle their yellow star points above the reverent throng within the altar rails. The soft baritone of the cardinal intoned a single phrase in the suspended silence. The censer took up the note in its delicate clink, clink, as it swung to and fro in the hands of a fair-haired child. Then the organ, pausing an instant in a deep, mellow, long-drawn note, burst suddenly into a magnificent strain, and the choir sang forth Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. One voice, flute-like, piercing, sweet, rang high over the rest. Sister Josefa heard and trembled as she buried her face in her hands and let her tears fall like other beads through her rosary. It was when the final word of the service had been intoned, the last peal of the exit march had died away, that she looked up meekly to encounter a pair of youthful brown eyes gazing pityingly upon her. That was all she remembered for a moment, that the eyes were youthful and handsome and tender. Later she saw that they were placed in a rather beautiful boyish face, surmounted by waves of brown hair curling and soft, and that the head was set on a pair of shoulders decked in military uniform. Then the brown eyes marched away with the rest of the rear guard, and the white-bonneted sisters filed out the side door, through the narrow court, back into the brown convent. That night Sister Josefa tossed more than usual on her hard bed, and clasped her fingers often in prayer to quell the wickedness in her heart. Turn where she would, pray as she might, there was ever a pair of tender, pitying brown eyes haunting her persistently. The squeaky organ at vespers intoned the clank of military accoutrements to her ears. The white bonnets of the sisters about her faded into mists of curling brown hair. Briefly, Sister Josefa was in love. The days went on pretty much as before, save for the one little heart that beat rebelliously now and then, though it tried so hard to be submissive. There was the morning work in the refectory, the stupid little girls to teach sewing, and the insatiable lamps that were so greedy for oil. And always the tender boyish brown eyes that looked so sorrowfully at the fragile, beautiful little sister, haunting, following, pleading. Perchance, had Sister Josefa been in the world, the eyes would have been an incident, but in this home of self-repression and retrospection it was a life story. The eyes had gone their way, doubtless forgetting the little sister they pitied, but the little sister. The days glided into weeks, the weeks into months. Thoughts of escape had come to Sister Josefa, to flee into the world, to merge in the great city where recognition was impossible, and working her way, like the rest of humanity, perchance encounter the eyes again. It was all planned and ready. She would wait until some morning when the little band of black-robed sisters wended their way to mass at the cathedral. When it was time to file out the side door into the courtway, she would linger at prayers, then slip out another door, and unseen glide up Chartres Street to Canal, and once there mingle in the throng that filled the wide thoroughfare. Beyond this first plan she could think no further. Penniless, garbed and shaven though she would be, other difficulties never presented themselves to her. She would rely on the mercies of the world to help her escape from this torturing life of inertia. It seemed easy now that the first step of decision had been taken. The Saturday night before the final day had come, and she lay feverishly nervous in her narrow little bed, wondering with wide-eyed fear at the morrow. Pale-eyed Sister Dominica and Sister Francesca were whispering together in the dark silence, and Sister Josefa's ears pricked up as she heard her name. "She is not well, poor child," said Francesca. "I fear the life is too confining." "It is best for her," was the reply. "You know, sister, how hard it would be for her in the world, with no name but Camille, no friends, and her beauty, and then—" Sister Josepha heard no more, for her heart, beating tumultuously in her bosom, drowned the rest. Like the rush of the bitter salt tide over a drowning man clinging to a spar, came the complete submerging of her hopes of another life. No name but Camille, that was true. No nationality, for she could never tell from whom or whence she came. No friends, and a beauty that not even an ungainly bonnet and shaven head could hide. In a flash she realized the deception of the life she would lead, and the cruel self-torture of wonder at her own identity. Already, as if in anticipation of the world's questionings, she was asking herself, "Who am I? What am I?" The next morning the Sisters du Sacré-Cœur filed into the cathedral at high mass and bent devout knees at the general confession. "Confiteor Deo omnipotenti," murmured the priest, and tremblingly one little sister followed the words, "Je confesse à Dieu tout-puissant que j'ai beaucoup péché par pensée. C'est ma faute, c'est ma faute, c'est ma très grande faute." The organ pealed forth as mass ended. The throng slowly filed out, and the sisters paced through the courtway back into the brown convent walls. One paused at the entrance and gazed with swift longing eyes in the direction of narrow squalid Chartres Street, then with a gulping sob followed the rest and vanished behind the heavy door. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Praline Woman. The praline woman sits by the side of the Archbishop's quaint little old chapel on Royal Street and slowly waves her latanier fan over the pink and brown wares. "Pralines, pralines, ah, mam'zelle, you buy? S'il vous plaît, mam'zelle, ces pralines, they be fine, very fresh." "Mais non, maman, you are not sure?" "Sho, child, ma bibi, ma petite, she put dese up hisself. He's hands so small, mam'zelle, like you's, mais brune. She put dese up dis morn. You take none? No husband for you den?" "Ah, ma petite, you take 5 sous, baby. May le bon Dieu keep you good." "Mais oui, madame, I know you étranger. You don't look like dese New Orleans peop. You like those Yankee dat come down for de war." Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, chimes the cathedral bell across Jackson Street, and the praline woman crosses herself. "Hail Mary, full of grace." "Pralines, madame, you buy lak dat? 10 sous, madame, and one little piece for l'agnappe, for madame's lil bibi. Ah, c'est bon." "Pralines, pralines, so fresh, so fine, monsieur would lak some for he's lil gal at home. Mais no, what's dat you say? She's daid. Ah, monsieur, 'tis my little gal what died long year ago. Misery, misery." "Here come dat lazy Indian squaw. What she good fo', anyhow? She just sit like dat in de French market and sell her file, and sleep, 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 like so, in he's blanket. Hey dere, you, Tonita, how goes you business?" "Pralines, pralines, Holy Father, you give me dat blessin' show. Take one. I know you like dat white one. It tastes good, I know, bien." "Pralines, madam, I like your face. What for you wear black? You little boy, daid. You take one. Just see how it tastes. I had one little boy once. He just grow 12. He's a big like dis. Then one day he take sick and die. Oh, madame, it most break my po' heart. I burn candle in St. Rocque. I say my beads. I sprinkle holy water round he's bed. He just lay so. He's eyes turn up. He say, 'Maman, maman.' Then he die. Madame, you take one. No, no, no l'argent. You take one for my little boy's sake." "Pralines, pralines, monsieur. Who make dese? My little gal, Didella, of course. No, no, I don't make no more. Po Tante Marie get too old. Didelle, she's one little gal I 'dopt. I see her one day in de street. He walk so hit cold, she shiver and say, "Where you gone, little gal?" And he can't tell. He just grip close to me and cry so. Then I take her home wid me, and she say he's named Didelle. You see, dey want nobody dere. My little gal, she's dead of de yellow fever. My little boy, he's dead. Po Tante Marie, all alone. Didelle, she grow fine. She keep house and mek pralines. Den when night come, she sit wid his guitar and sing. Tu l'aimes, c'est 3 jours. Tu l'aimes, c'est 3 jours. Ma cœur à toi, ma cœur à toi. Tu l'aimes, c'est 3 jours. Ah, he's fine gal is Didelle. Pralines, pralines. Dat little cloud, it look like rain. I hope no. Here come dat lazy Irish man down de street. I don't like Irish man. Me non, dey so funny. One day one Irish man he say to me, "Auntie, what for you talk so?" And I just say back, "What for you say? Faith and be jabers. No, I don't like Irishman me." Here come de rain. Now I got for to go. Didelle she be wait for me. Down hit come. It fall in de Mississip and fill up so clean to de levee. Then we have big crevasse and po Tante Marie float away. Bonjour, madame, you come again. Pralines, pralines. End of Section 11. Section 12 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Odalie. Now and then carnival time comes at the time of the good Saint Valentine, and then sometimes it comes as late as the warm days in March, when spring is indeed upon us, and the greenness of the grass outvies the green in the royal standards. Days and days before the carnival proper, New Orleans begins to take on a festive appearance. Here and there the royal flags with their glowing greens and violets and yellow appear, and then as if by magic the streets and buildings flame and burst like poppies out of bud into a glorious refulgence of color that steeps the senses into a languorous acceptance of warmth and beauty. On Mardi Gras Day, as you know, it is a town gone mad with folly, a huge masked ball emptied into the streets at daylight, a meeting of all nations on common ground, a potpourri of every conceivable human ingredient but faintly describes it all. There are music and flowers, cries and laughter and song and joyousness, and never an aching heart to show its sorrow or dim the happiness of the streets. A wondrous thing, this carnival. But the old cronies down in Frenchtown, who know everything and can recite you many a story, tell of one sad heart on Mardi Gras years ago. It was a woman's, of course, for il est toujours les femmes qui sont malheureuses, says an old proverb, and perhaps it is right. This woman, a child she would be called elsewhere, save in this land of tropical growth and precocity, lost her heart to one who never knew, a very common story, by the way, but one which would have been quite distasteful to the haughty judge, her father, had he known. Odalie was beautiful. Odalie was haughty, too, but gracious enough to those who pleased her dainty fancy. In the old French house on Royal Street, with its quaint windows and Spanish courtyard, green and cool, and made musical by the plashing of the fountain and the trill of caged birds, lived Odalie in convent-like seclusion. Monsieur le Juge was determined no hawk should break through the cage and steal his dove, and so, though there was no mother, a stern duenna aunt kept faithful watch. Alas for the precautions of Latin! bright eyes that search for other bright eyes, in which lurks the spirit of youth, and mischiefs are ever on the lookout, even in church. Dutifully was Odile marched to the cathedral every Sunday to mass, and Tante Louise, nodding devoutly over her beads, could not see the blushes and glances full of meaning, a whole code of signals, as it were, that passed between Odile and Pierre, the impecunious young clerk in the court-room. Odile loved perhaps because there was not much else to do. When one is shut up in a great French house with a grim, sleepy tante, and no companions of one's own age, life becomes a dull thing, and one is ready for any new sensation, particularly if in the veins there bounds the tempestuous Spanish-French blood that Monsieur le Juge boasted of. So Odile hugged the image of her Pierre during the weekdays, and played tremulous little love songs to it in the twilight, when La Tante dozed over her devotion book, and on Sundays at Mass there were glances and blushes, and mayhap at some especially remembered time the touch of finger-tips at the holy water font, while La Tante dropped her last genuflection. Then came the carnival time, and one little heart beat faster as the grey house on Royal Street hung out its many-hued flags, and draped its grim front with glowing colours. It was to be a time of joy and relaxation, when every one could go abroad, and in the crowds one could speak to whom one chose. Unconscious plans formulated, and the petite Odile was quite happy as the time drew near. "Only think, Tante Louise," she would cry, "what a happy time it is to be!" But Tante Louise only grumbled, as was her wont. It was Mardi Gras day at last, and early through her window Odile could hear the jingle of folly bells on the maskers' costumes, the tinkle of music and the echoing strains of songs. Up to her ears there floated the laughter of the older maskers, and the screams of the little children, frightened at their own images under the mask and domino. What a hurry to be out, and in the motley merry throng, to be pacing Royal Street to Canal Street. Where was life and the world? They were tired eyes with which Odile looked at the gay pageant at last, tired with watching throng after throng of maskers, of the unmasked, of peering into the carts full of singing minstrels, into carriages of revellers, hoping for a glimpse of Pierre the devout. The allegorical carts, rumbling by with their important red-clothed horses, were beginning to lose charm. The disguises showed tawdry. Even the gay-hued flags fluttered sadly to Odile. Mardi Gras was a tiresome day after all, she sighed, and Tante Louise agreed with her for once. 6 o'clock had come, an hour when all masks must be removed. The long red rays of the setting sun glinted athwart the many-hued costumes of the revellers trooping unmasked homeward to rest for the night's last mad frolic. Down Toulouse Street there came the merriest throng of all, young men and women in dainty fairy-like garb, dancers and dresses of the picturesque empire, a butterfly or two and a dame here and there, with powdered hair and graces of olden time. Singing with unmasked faces, they danced toward Tante Louise and Odile. She stood with eyes lustrous and tear-heavy, for there in the front was Pierre, Pierre the faithless, his arms about the slender waist of a butterfly, whose tinselled powdered hair floated across the lace ruffles of his empire coat. "Pierre!" cried Odile softly. No one heard, for it was a mere faint breath, and fell unheeded. Instead, the laughing throng pelted her with flowers and candy, and went their way, and even Pierre did not see. You see, when one is shut up in the grim walls of a Royal Street house, with no one but a Tante Louise and a grim judge, how is one to learn that in this world there are faithless ones who may glance tenderly into one's eyes at Mass, and pass the holy water on caressing fingers without being madly in love? There was no one to tell Odile, so she sat at home in the dull first days of Lent, and nursed her dear dead love, and mourned, as women have done from time immemorial, over the faithlessness of man. And when one day she asked that she might go back to the Ursulines' convent where her childish days were spent, only to go this time as a nun, Monsieur le Juge and Tante Louise thought it quite the proper and convenient thing to do, for how were they to know the secret of that Mardi Gras day? End of section 12. Section 13. of the Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. La Juanita. If you never lived in Mandeville, you cannot appreciate the thrill of wholesome, satisfied joy which sweeps over its inhabitants every evening at 5 o'clock. It is the hour for the arrival of the new camellia, the happening of the day. As early as 4 o'clock, the trailing smoke across the horizon of the treacherous Lake Pontchartrain appears, and Mandeville knows then that the hour for its siesta has passed, and that it must array itself in its coolest and fluffiest garments, and go down to the pier to meet this sole connection between itself and the outside world, the little puffy side-wheel steamer that comes daily from New Orleans and brings the mail and the news. On this particular day there was an air of suppressed excitement about the little knot of people which gathered on the pier. To be sure, there were no outward signs to show that anything unusual had occurred. The small folks danced with the same glee over the worn boards, and peered down with daring excitement into the perilous depths of the water below. The sun, fast sinking in a gorgeous glow behind the pines of the Tchefuncta region far away, danced his mischievous rays in much the same manner that he did every other day. But there was a something in the air, a something not tangible but mysterious, subtle. You could catch an indescribable whiff of it in your inner senses by the half-eager, furtive glances that the small crowd cast at La Juanita. "Gar, gar, le bateau," said one dark-tressed mother to the wide-eyed baby. "Eh, oui," she added in an undertone to her companion. "Voilà la Juanita." La Juanita, you must know, was the pride of Mandeville, the adored, the admired of all, with her petite, half-Spanish, half-French beauty. Whether rocking in the shade of the Cherokee rose-covered gallery of Grandpère Colombe's big house, her fair face bonnet shaded, her dainty hands gloved to keep the sun from too close an acquaintance, or splashing the spray from the bow of her little pirogue, or fluffing her skirts about her tiny feet on the pier, she was the pet and ward of Mandeville, as it were, La Juanita Alvarez, since Madame Alvarez was a widow, and Grand-Père Colombe was strict and stern. And now La Juanita had set her small foot down with a passionate stamp before Grand-Père Colombe's very face, and tossed her black curls about her wilful head, and said she would go to the pier this evening to meet her mercer. All Mandeville knew this, and cast its furtive glances alternately at La Juanita with two big pink spots in her cheeks, and at the entrance to the pier, expecting Grand-Père Colombe and a scene. The sun cast red glows and violet shadows over the pier, and the pines murmured a soft little vesper hymn among themselves up on the beach as the new camellia swung herself in, crabby, sideways like a fat old gentleman going into a small door. There was the clang of an important bell, the scream of a hoarse little whistle, and Mandeville rushed to the gang-plank to welcome the outside world. Juanita put her hand through a waiting arm, and tripped away with her mercer, big and blonde and brawny. "Un Américain, pas," said the little mother of the black eyes, and Mandeville sighed sadly and shook its head, and was sorry for Grand-Père Colombe. This was Saturday, and the big regatta would be Monday. Ah, that regatta, such a one as Mandeville had never seen. There were to be boats from Madisonville and Amite, from Louisburg and Covington, and even far away Knott's Point. There was to be a Class A and Class B and Class C, and the little French girls of the town flaunted their ribbons down the one oak-shaded lake-kissed street, and dared anyone to say theirs were not the favorite colors. In Class A was entered La Juanita, Captain Mercer Grangeman. Colors pink and gold, her name, her colors, what impudence! Of course, now, being a Mandevillian, you could not understand the shame of Grand-Père Colombe at this. Was it not bad enough for his petite Juanita, his Spanish blossom, his hope of a family that had held itself proudly aloof from those Américains from time immemorial, to have smiled upon this mercer, this pale-eyed youth? Was it not bad enough for her to demean herself by walking upon the pier with him, but for a boat, his boat, un bateau américain, to be named La Juanita? Oh, the shame of it! Grand-Père Colombe prayed a devout prayer to the Virgin that La Juanita should be capsized. Monday came, clear and blue and stifling. The waves of hot air danced on the sands and adown the one street merrily. Glassily calm lay the Pont Chartrain. Heavily still hung the atmosphere. Madame Alvarez cast an inquiring glance toward the sky. Grand-père Colombe chuckled. He had not lived on the shores of the treacherous Lake Pont Chartrain for nothing. He knew its every mood, its petulances and passions. He knew this glassy warmth and what it meant. Chuckling again and again, he stepped to the gallery and looked out over the lake and at the pier where lay the boats rocking and idly tugging at their moorings. La Juanita, in her rose-scented room, tied the pink ribbons on her dainty frock and fastened cloth of gold roses at her lithe waist. It was said that just before the crack of the pistol La Juanita's tidy hand lay in Mercer's, and that he bent his head and whispered softly so that the surrounding crowd could not hear, "Juanita, mind, if I win, you will?" "Oui, mon monsieur, if you win." In another instant the white wings were off, scudding before the rising breeze, dipping their glossy boat sides into the clear water, straining their cordage in their tense efforts to reach the stake boats. Mandeville indiscriminately distributed itself on piers, large and small, bathhouse tops, trees, and craft of all kinds, from pirogue, dory, and pine raft to pretentious catboat and shell schooner. Mandeville cheered and strained its eyes after all the boats, but chiefly was its attention directed to La Juanita. "Ah, voilà, it is ahead. Mais non, c'est un autre. La Juanita, regardez, Grand-père Colombe." Old Colombes, on the big pier with Madame Alvarez and his granddaughter, was intently straining his weather-beaten face in the direction of Knott's Point, his back resolutely turned upon the scudding white wings. A sudden chuckle of grim satisfaction caused La Petite's head to toss petulantly, but only for a minute, for Grand-père Colombe's chuckle was followed by a shout of dismay from those whose glance had followed his. You must know that it is around Knott's Point that the Storm King shows its wings first, for the little peninsula guards the entrance which leads into the southeast waters of the stormy Rigolets and the blustering Gulf. You would know, if you lived in Mandeville, that when the pines on Knott's Point darken and when the water shows white beyond like the teeth of a hungry wolf, it is time to steer your boat into the mouth of some one of the many calm bayous which flow silently throughout St. Tammany parish into the lake. Small wonder that the cry of dismay went up now, for Knott's Point was black, with a lurid light overhead, and the roar of the grim southeast wind came ominously over the water. La Juanita clasped her hands and strained her eyes for her namesake. The razors had rounded the second stake boat, and the course of the triangle headed them directly for the lurid cloud. You should have seen Grand-père Colombe then. He danced up and down the pier in a perfect frenzy. The thin, pale lips of Madame Alvarez moved in a silent prayer. La Juanita stood coldly silent. And now you could see that the advance guard of the southeast force had struck the little fleet. They dipped and scurried and rocked, and you could see the sails being reefed hurriedly, and almost hear the rigging creak and moan under the strain. Then the wind came up the lake and struck the town with a tumultuous force. The waters rose and heaved in the long, sullen ground swell, which betokened serious trouble. There was a rush of lake craft to shelter. Heavy grey waves boomed against the breakwaters, and piers dashing their brackish spray upon the strained watches. Then, with a shriek and a howl, the storm burst full, with blinding sheets of rain, and a great hurricane of Gulf wind that threatened to blow the little town away. La Juanita was proud when Grand-père and Madame led her away in the storm, though her face was white and the rose mouth pressed close. Not a word did she say, and her eyes were as bright as ever before. It was foolish to hope that the frail boats could survive such a storm. There was not even the merest excuse for shelter out in the waters, and when Lake Pont Chartrain grows angry, it devours without pity. Your tropical storm is soon over, however, and in an hour the sun struggled through a grey and misty sky, over which the wind was sweeping great clouds. The raindrops hung diamond-like on the thick foliage, but the long ground swell still boomed against the breakwaters and showed white teeth far to the south. As chickens creep from under shelter after a rain, so the people of Mandeville crept out again on the piers, on the bathhouses, on the breakwater edge, and watched eagerly for the boats. Slowly upon the horizon appeared white sails, and the little craft swung into sight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, counted Mandeville, every one coming in. Bravo! And a great cheer that swept the whole length of the town from the post office to Black Bayou went up. Bravo! Every boat was coming in, but was every man? This was a sobering thought, and in the hush which followed it you could hear the Q and C train thundering over the great lake bridge miles away. Well, they came into the pier at last, La Juanita in the lead, and as Captain Mercer landed, he was surrounded by a voluble, chattering, anxious throng that loaded him with questions in patois, in broken English, and in French. He was no longer un Americain. Now he was a hero. When the other aid boats came in and Mandeville saw that no one was lost, there was another ringing bravo and more chattering of questions. We heard the truth finally when the storm burst. Captain Mercer suddenly promoted himself to an admiralship and assumed command of his little fleet. He had led them through the teeth of the gale to a small inlet on the coast between Bayou Lacombe and Knots Point, and there they had waited until the storm passed. Loud were the praises of the other captains for Admiral Mercer. Profuse were the thanks of the sisters and sweethearts as he was carried triumphantly on the shoulders of the sailors adown the wharf to the Maison Colombe. The crispness had gone from Juanita's pink frock, and the cloth of gold roses were well nigh petalless, but the hand that she slipped into his was warm and soft, and the eyes that were upturned to Mercer's blue ones were shining with admiring tears. And even Grand-Père Colombe, as he brewed on the Cherokee rose-covered gallery a fiery punch for the heroes, was heard to admit that sometime dos Americains can most be like one Frenchman. And we danced at the betrothal supper the next week. End of section 13. Section 14 of The Goodness of St. Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tahiti. It was cold that day. The great, sharp north wind swept out Elysian Fields Street in blasts that made men shiver and bent everything in their track. The skies hung lowering and gloomy. The usually quiet street was more than deserted. It was dismal. Tahiti leaned against one of the brown freight cars for protection against the shrill norther, and warmed his little chapped hands at a blaze of chips and dry grass. "Maybe it'll snow," he muttered, casting a glance at the sky that would have done credit to a practised seaman. "Then won't I have fun? Ugh, but the wind blows." It was Saturday, or Tahiti would have been in school, the big yellow school on Marigny Street, where he went every day when its bell boomed 9 o'clock, and went with a run and a joyous whoop, ostensibly to imbibe knowledge, really to make his teacher's life a burden. Idle, lazy, dirty, troublesome boy, she called him to herself as day by day wore on, and Tahiti improved not, but let his whole class pass him on its way to a higher grade. A practical joke he relished infinitely more than a practical problem, and a good game at pin-sticking was far more entertaining than a language lesson. Moreover, he was always hungry, and would eat in school before the 10:30 recess, thereby losing much good playtime for his voracious appetite. But there was nothing in natural history that Tahiti did not know. He could dissect a butterfly or a mosquito hawk, and describe their parts as accurately as a spectacled student with a scalpel and microscope could talk about a cadaver. The entire third district, with its swamps and canals and commons and railroad sections, and its wondrous, crooked, tortuous streets, was an open book to Tahiti. There was not a nook or corner that he did not know or could not tell of. There was not a bit of gossip among the gamins, little Creole and Spanish fellows with dark skins and lovely eyes, like spaniels, that Tahiti could not tell of. He knew just exactly when it was time for crawfish to be plentiful down in the Claiborne and Marigny canals, just when a poor breadless fellow might get a job in the big bone yard and fertilizing factory out on the railroad track. And as for the levee, with its ships and schooners and sailors, how he could revel in them. The wondrous ships, the pretty little schooners, where the foreign-looking sailors lay on long moonlight nights, singing to their guitars and telling great stories. All these things and more could Tahiti tell of. He had been down to the Gulf and out on its treacherous waters through the Eads jetties on a fishing smack with some jolly brown sailors, and could interest the whole schoolroom in the talk lessons if he chose. Tahiti shivered as the wind swept round the freight cars. There isn't much warmth in a bit of a Jersey coat. "Wish 'twas summer," he murmured, casting another sailor's glance at the sky. "Don't believe I like snow. It's too wet and cold." And with a last parting caress at the little fire he had builded for a minute's warmth, he plunged his hands in his pockets, shut his teeth, and started manfully on his mission out the railroad track toward the swamps. It was late when Titi came home, to such a home as it was, and he had but illy performed his errand. So his mother beat him and sent him to bed supperless. A sharp strap stings in cold weather, and a long walk in the teeth of a biting wind creates a keen appetite. But if Titi cried himself to sleep that night, he was up bright and early next morning, had been to mass, devoutly kneeling on the cold floor, blowing his fingers to keep them warm, and was home almost before the rest of the family were awake. There was evidently some great matter of business on the young man's mind, for he scarcely ate his breakfast and left the table soon, eagerly cramming the remainder of his meal in his pockets. "Ma foi, but what now?" mused his mother, as she watched his little form sturdily trudging the track in the face of the wind, his head with the rimless cap thrust close on the shock of black hair bent low, his hands thrust deep in the bulging pockets. "A new live play toy hit, maybe," ventured the father. "He is one funny child." The next day Titi was late for school. It was something unusual, for he was always the first on hand to fix some plan of mechanism to make the teacher miserable. She looked reprovingly at him this morning when he came in during arithmetic class, his hair all wind-blown, his cheeks rosy from a hard fight with the sharp blast. But he made up for his tardiness by his extreme goodness all day. Just think, Titi did not even eat once before noon, a something unparalleled in the entire previous history of his school life. When the lunch hour came, and all the yard was a scene of feast and fun, one of the boys found him standing by a post disconsolately watching a ham sandwich as it rapidly disappeared down the throat of a sturdy, square-headed little fellow. "Hello, Edgar," he said. "What you got for lunch?" "Nothin'," was the mournful reply. "Why don't you stop eatin' in school for a change? You don't ever have nothin' to eat." "I didn't eat to day," said Titi, blazing up. "You did. I tell you I didn't." And Titi's hard little fist planted a punctuation mark on his comrade's eye. A fight in the schoolyard. Poor Titi was in disgrace again. Still, in spite of his battered appearance, a severe scolding from the principal, lines to write, and a further punishment from his mother, Titi scarcely remained for his dinner, but was off down the railroad track, with his pockets partly stuffed with the remnants of the scanty meal. And the next day Titi was tardy again, and lunchless too, and the next, until the teacher in despair sent a nicely printed note to his mother about him, which might have done some good had not Titi taken great pains to tear it up on the way home. One day it rained, whole bucketsful of water, that poured in torrents from a miserable, angry sky. Too wet a day for bits of boys to be trudging to school, so Titi's mother thought. So she kept him at home to watch the weather through the window, fretting and fuming like a regular storm in miniature. As the day wore on, and the rain did not abate, his mother kept a strong watch upon him, for he tried many times to slip away. Dinner came and went, and the grey soddenness of the skies deepened into the blackness of coming night. Someone called Titi to go to bed, and Titi was nowhere to be found. Under the beds, in closets and corners, in such impossible places as the soap dish and water pitcher even, they searched, but he had gone as completely as if he had been spirited away. It was of no use to call up the neighbours. He had never been near their houses, they affirmed, so there was nothing to do but to go to the railroad track, where Titi had been seen so often trudging in the shrill north wind. With lanterns and sticks and his little yellow dog, the rescuing party started down the track. The rain had ceased falling, but the wind blew a gale, scurrying great grey clouds over a fierce sky. It was not exactly dark, though in this part of the city there is neither gas nor electricity, and on such a night as this neither moon nor stars dared show their faces in so grey a sky, but a sort of all-diffused luminosity was in the air, as though the sea of atmosphere was charged with an ethereal phosphorescence. Search as they did, there were no signs of Titi. The soft earth between the railroad ties crumbled between their feet without showing any small tracks or footprints. We may as well return," said the big brother. "He is not here." "Oh, mon Dieu," urged the mother. He is, I know it." So on they went, slipping on the wet earth, stumbling over the loose rocks, until a sudden wild yelp from Tiger brought them to a standstill. He had rushed ahead of them, and his voice could be heard in the distance, howling piteously. With a fresh impetus the little muddy party hurried forward. Tiger's yelps could be heard plainer and plainer, mingled now with a muffled, plaintive little wail. After a while they found a pitiful little heap of sodden rags lying at the foot of a mound of earth and stones thrown upon the side of the track. It was Tai-Ti with a broken leg, all wet and miserable and moaning. They picked him up tenderly and started to carry him home, but he cried and clung to the mother and begged not to go. "Ah, mon pauvre enfant, he has the fever," wailed the mother. "No, no, it's my old man. He's hungry," sobbed Tai-Ti, holding out a little package. It was the remnants of his dinner, all wet and rain-washed. "What old man?" asked the big brother. "My old man. Oh, please, please don't go home till I see him. I'm not hurting much. I can go." So, yielding to his whim, they carried him farther away, down the sides of the track, up to an embankment or levee by the sides of the Marigny Canal. Then the big brother, suddenly stopping, exclaimed, "Why, here's a cave. Is it Robinson Crusoe?" "It's my old man's cave," cried Tai-Ti. "Oh, please go in. Maybe he's dead." There cannot be much ceremony in entering a cave. There is but one thing to do, walk in. This they did, and holding up the lantern beheld a weird sight. On a bed of straw and paper in one corner lay a withered, wizened, white-bearded old man with wide eyes staring at the unaccustomed light. In the other corner was an equally dilapidated cow. "It's my old man," cried Tai-Ti joyfully. "Oh, please, grandpa, I couldn't get here to-day. It rained all morning, and when I ran away I fell down and broke something, and, oh, grandpa, I'm all tired and hurty, and I'm so afraid you're hungry." So the secret of Tai-Ti's jaunts down the railroad was out. In one of his trips around the swampland he had discovered the old man exhausted from cold and hunger in the fields. Together they had found this cave, and Tai-Ti had gathered the straw and paper that made the bed. Then a tramp cow, old and turned adrift too, had crept in and shared the damp dwelling, and thither Tai-Ti had trudged twice a day, carrying his luncheon in the morning and his dinner in the afternoon. "There's a crown in heaven for that child," said the officer of charity to whom the case was referred. But as for Tai-Ti, when the leg was well, he went his way as before. End of section 14. End of The Goodness of Saint Rocque and Other Stories by Alice Dunbar Nelson.